The morning Marcus Teller turned 16, his father changed the locks. Not in a dramatic way. There was no argument on the porch, no final exchange of hard words under a porch light. Marcus simply came home from school one afternoon in late October to find his key didn't work, his duffel bag sitting on the front step like a returned package, and a single folded note tucked under the door knocker. He didn't read the note until he was a block away, hands shaking from something that wasn't quite cold. The words were short. His stepmother had written them in the careful cursive she used for grocery lists and birthday cards. This isn't working for any of us. Your father agrees. There's money in the envelope for a bus ticket. Don't come back. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The envelope held $47 and a rusted locker key with a cardboard tag tied to it with kitchen twine. His father's handwriting on the tag, barely legible, like the man had been in a hurry or ashamed enough to make it quick. Storage Unit 114, Garfield Self-Storage, Millhaven. Paid through end of year. After that, up to you. Marcus stood on the sidewalk in the October cold and looked at that key for a long time. He was wearing his school jacket, carrying a bag that held 2 changes of clothes, a library book he hadn't finished, and the photograph from his nightstand. His mother, dead 3 years by then, smiling at a camera she didn't know was pointed at her. He put the key in his pocket, dropped the note in a trash can, and didn't look back. He told himself he wouldn't think about that key again. He was wrong about that for 22 years. There's a particular kind of survival that doesn't look like anything from the outside. No dramatic moments, no obvious battles. Just a person putting one foot in front of the other through circumstances that would have stopped someone with more to lose. Marcus Teller learned that kind of survival young, and he got very good at it. He spent the first winter couch surfing between 3 different friends' houses, rationing the $47 until it was gone, then finding odd jobs that paid cash. Yard work, moving furniture, standing outside the hardware store on Saturday mornings when contractors pulled up looking for day labor. He graduated high school the following June through a combination of stubbornness and the quiet intervention of a teacher named Mr. Adeola, who noticed that Marcus was brilliant when he wasn't exhausted and found ways to make sure he had somewhere warm to do his homework. Mr. Adeola also helped him apply for the vocational grant that got him 18 months of machining school. That led to a job at Hargrove Precision Components, a small manufacturing company that made medical-grade parts for surgical equipment. The work was exacting, demanding, the kind of thing that rewarded patience and penalized sloppiness. Marcus was good at it in the way people become good at things when they have no safety net completely, without reservation, because the alternative was falling. By 25, he had his own apartment. A real one, not a room in someone else's house. By 28, he had a modest savings account and a used truck that started every morning without argument. He didn't talk about where he'd come from. Not because he was ashamed, exactly, but because he'd learned early that people heard abandoned at 16 and immediately assigned him a category, and categories made them comfortable in ways that weren't always useful to him. He had a small circle of people who knew him well. Darren, who'd been his supervisor at Hargrove for 6 years before they both moved on to other things. Yolanda, who ran the laundromat 2 blocks from his apartment and had quietly extended him credit during a period when the company was doing layoffs and he was nervous about his position. And Celia, his downstairs neighbor for 4 years, who left food outside his door when she cooked too much and never made it weird. He was 38 when the letter came. By then he was working as a shift lead at Consolidated Fabrication, a larger plant that did contract work for the automotive industry. The money was steady. The hours were long. His life had a shape to it that he'd built carefully, piece by piece, from nothing at all, and he was quietly proud of it in the way people are proud of things they've built alone. The letter arrived on a Thursday in February, forwarded twice, the envelope soft at the corners from handling. The return address was a law office in Millhaven, the same town where his father had directed him to that storage unit 22 years ago. The law firm was called Adissa and Morell, and the letter inside was written on heavy cream paper in the careful language of people who have been trained to deliver complicated information neutrally. Dear Mr. Teller, we are writing in connection with the estate of Gordon Teller, deceased, and a matter that requires your attention at your earliest convenience. Mr. Gordon Teller passed on January 9th of this year. In reviewing his estate documents, Certain items have come to light that relate directly to you. We would ask that you contact this office to schedule an appointment. We are unable to provide full details in writing, but we wish to communicate that this matter may be of significant consequence to you. Marcus read it 3 times at his kitchen table, still in his work clothes. Then he set it down and looked out the window at the parking lot below for a while. His father was dead. He tried to locate something inside himself in response to that information, the way you try to find a sound you're not sure you heard. There was grief in there somewhere, muffled and complicated. Not the clean kind. The kind that comes from mourning something that was already gone long. Before a person stopped breathing. What he mostly felt was tired, and then, underneath the tired, curious. Because his father had never had money. His father had driven the same truck for 11 years and worked maintenance at the county school district until his knees gave out. So what, exactly, had the lawyers found that was of significant consequence? He called the number on the letterhead the next morning. The woman who answered put him through to a man named Elliot, who spoke with the measured warmth of someone who'd made calls like this before. He was sorry for Marcus's loss. He understood this might be surprising. The firm was handling the distribution of Gordon Teller's estate, modest in most respects, and in the course of doing so, had identified something that had belonged to Marcus's mother, Diane Teller, born Diane Corwell, who had passed away when Marcus was 13. Marcus went very still. His mother, Elliot, explained that Diane Teller had, prior to her illness, placed certain items in secure storage, separate from the family home, and had recorded this in a document held by a different attorney who had since also passed. The chain of custody was complicated, Odysseus said. It had taken time to trace. But the upshot was this: a storage unit in Millhaven, originally registered to Diane Corwell, had never been claimed. The facility had been sold twice over the years, but the unit itself had been maintained, fees paid from a small trust account whose existence nobody had apparently thought to question. The trust had recently expired, and in the process of closing out the account, the facility's new owners had contacted the law firm. The locker key, Marcus said. Storage unit 114. There was a pause on the line. You know about it. My father gave it to me when he put me out. I never went. Another pause, longer this time. Mr. Teller, I think it would be worth your while to come to Millhaven. He drove down on a Saturday, leaving before dawn to beat the traffic. Millhaven was 4 hours south, a mid-sized city that had been industrial once, and was in the long process of deciding what it wanted to be next. He'd been back twice in 22 years, both times briefly, both times for reasons that didn't take him anywhere near his father's neighborhood or the storage facility on Garfield Street. Garfield Self-Storage had changed ownership 3 times based on the different logos faded into the exterior wall. The current iteration was called Secure Vault, with a newer building grafted onto the original 1970 structure. The manager, a woman named Priya, had been expecting him. She walked him to Unit 114 without asking many questions, which he appreciated. The unit was at the end of a corridor on the ground floor, tucked into a corner where the fluorescent lights were slightly dimmer than everywhere else. The door was metal, painted the same industrial gray as the rest of them. The padlock was old, the original. He could tell from the way the brass had developed that particular dark patina that took decades, not years. The rusted key from 22 years ago was in his jacket pocket. He'd found it that morning in the small wooden box he kept on his dresser, where he stored things that mattered enough to keep but not enough to display. He'd put it there when he was 16 and not touched it since. It took some working. The lock resisted, as if it had grown accustomed to being left alone. But it opened. He felt the mechanism give, heard the click, and lifted the shackle free. He pulled up the door. The unit was 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, lit now by the single bulb on a cord that Priya clicked on for him. It smelled the way old storage smells: dry paper, fabric softener from decades ago, something faintly metallic underneath. There were boxes, neatly stacked, labeled in his mother's handwriting. He recognized it immediately, the rounded letters, the way she always put a little curl on the capital D. Filing boxes, mostly. Archive boxes with lids. A few plastic bins sealed with tape. And against the back wall, a steel cabinet, gray, the kind used in offices, locked with a combination dial. He stood in the doorway for a moment without moving. His mother had put these here. His mother, who had died of ovarian cancer when he was 13, who had been sick for 2 years before that, who had managed in that time to work part-time as a bookkeeper, take care of Marcus, argue with insurance companies, and apparently also maintain a secret storage unit in a city they lived 40 minutes from, funded by a trust account, with a filing system careful enough to survive her by 25 years. He didn't know yet what any of it meant, but he understood, standing in that doorway, that whatever was in this room had been put here on purpose, with intention, by a woman who knew she was dying and chose to spend some of her remaining energy making sure this particular thing was preserved. He started with the closest box. The drive back to Elliot's office took 20 minutes. Marcus had spent 3 hours in the storage unit, going through boxes methodically the way he'd been trained to approach problems at work slowly, without assumptions, making sure you understood what you were looking at before you drew conclusions. He'd photographed everything with his phone. He'd taken careful notes in the app he used for work reminders. And he'd carried 4 of the most immediately significant boxes to his truck. Elliot was a tall man in his late 50s who wore his reading glasses around his neck and spoke with the precision of someone who had spent a career choosing words carefully in rooms where the wrong ones caused damage. He sat across from Marcus in an office that overlooked a small courtyard, and he listened without interrupting while Marcus described what he'd found. When Marcus finished, Ellis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you should stay in Millhaven for a few." Before a person stopped breathing. What he mostly felt was tired, and then, underneath the tired, curious. Because his father had never had money. His father had driven the same truck for 11 years and worked maintenance at the county school district until his knees gave out. So what, exactly, had the lawyers found that was of significant consequence? He called the number on the letterhead the next morning. The woman who answered put him through to a man named Elliot, who spoke with the measured warmth of someone who'd made calls like this before. He was sorry for Marcus's loss. He understood this might be surprising. The firm was handling the distribution of Gordon Teller's estate, modest in most respects, and in the course of doing so, had identified something that had belonged to Marcus's mother, Diane Teller, born Diane Corwell, who had passed away when Marcus was 13. Marcus went very still. His mother, Elliot, explained that Diane Teller had, prior to her illness, placed certain items in secure storage, separate from the family home, and had recorded this in a document held by a different attorney who had since also passed. The chain of custody was complicated, Odysseus said. It had taken time to trace. But the upshot was this: a storage unit in Millhaven, originally registered to Diane Corwell, had never been claimed. The facility had been sold twice over the years, but the unit itself had been maintained, fees paid from a small trust account whose existence nobody had apparently thought to question. The trust had recently expired, and in the process of closing out the account, the facility's new owners had contacted the law firm. "The locker key," Marcus said. "Storage unit 114. There was a pause on the line. "You know about it. My father gave it to me when he put me out. I never went." Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Teller, I think it would be worth your while to come to Millhaven." He drove down on a Saturday, leaving before dawn to beat the traffic. Millhaven was 4 hours south, a mid-sized city that had been industrial once and was in the long process of deciding what it wanted to be next. He'd been back twice in 22 years, both times briefly, both times for reasons that didn't take him anywhere near his father's neighborhood or the storage facility on Garfield Street. Garfield Self-Storage had changed ownership 3 times based on the different logos faded into the exterior wall. The current iteration was called Secure Vault, with a newer building grafted onto the original 1970s structure. The manager, a woman named Priya, had been expecting him. She walked him to Unit 114 without asking many questions, which he appreciated. The unit was at the end of a corridor on the ground floor, tucked into a corner where the fluorescent lights were slightly dimmer than everywhere else. The door was metal, painted the same industrial gray as the rest of them. The padlock was old, the original. He could tell from the way the brass had developed that particular dark patina that took decades, not years. The rusted key from 22 years ago was in his jacket pocket. He'd found it that morning in the small wooden box he kept on his dresser, where he stored things that mattered enough to keep but not enough to display. He'd put it there when he was 16 and not touched it since. It took some working. The lock resisted, as if it had grown accustomed to being left alone. But it opened. He felt the mechanism give, heard the click, and lifted the shackle free. He pulled up the door. The unit was 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, lit now by the single bulb on a cord that Priya clicked on for him. It smelled the way old storage smells dry paper, fabric softener from decades ago, something faintly metallic underneath. There were boxes, neatly stacked, labeled in his mother's handwriting. He recognized it immediately, the rounded letters, the way she always put a little curl on the capital D. Filing boxes, mostly. Archive boxes with lids. A few plastic bins sealed with tape. And against the back wall, a steel cabinet, gray, the kind used in offices, locked with a combination dial. He stood in the doorway for a moment without moving. His mother had put these here. His mother, who had died of ovarian cancer when he was 13, who had been sick for 2 years before that, who had managed in that time to work part-time as a bookkeeper, take care of Marcus, argue with insurance companies, and apparently also maintain a secret storage unit in a city they lived 40 minutes from, funded by a trust account, with a filing system careful enough to survive her by 25 years. He didn't know yet what any of it meant, but he understood, standing in that doorway, that whatever was in this room had been put here on purpose, with intention, by a woman who knew she was dying and chose to spend some of her remaining energy making sure this particular thing was preserved. He started with the closest box. The drive back to Elliot's office took 20 minutes. Marcus had spent 3 hours in the storage unit, going through boxes methodically the way he'd been trained to approach problems at work slowly, without assumptions, making sure you understood what you were looking at before you drew conclusions. He'd photographed everything with his phone. He'd taken careful notes in the app he used for work reminders. And he'd carried 4 of the most immediately significant boxes to his truck. Elliot was a tall man in his late 50s who wore his reading glasses around his neck and spoke with the precision of someone who had spent a career choosing words carefully in rooms where the wrong ones caused damage. He sat across from Marcus in an office that overlooked a small courtyard, and he listened without interrupting while Marcus described what he'd found. When Marcus finished, Ellis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you should stay in Millhaven for a few days. I have work Monday." "I understand. But Mr. Teller, what you've described, if I'm reading this correctly, this isn't a matter that can be handled in a single afternoon." Marcus looked at the boxes he'd carried in, stacked carefully beside Ellis's desk. The documents inside them were organized by year and by subject, going back to 1987. His mother had been a bookkeeper. She'd understood financial records the way Marcus understood machine tolerances, not just the what, but the why, the how, and the way small discrepancies were rarely accidents. What she'd documented, over the course of what appeared to be at least 4 years, was not her own finances. It was someone else's. The name that appeared most frequently was Corwell Industrial Holdings. His mother's maiden name had been Corwell. He hadn't known his mother had family with money. She'd never spoken of them. When he was young, he'd assumed her parents were dead, her siblings distant or non-existent. She'd come from somewhere else, she said when he asked, and that somewhere else wasn't somewhere they needed to visit. He'd accepted this with the easy incuriosity of a child who has enough to keep him occupied in the present. But Diane Corwell had grown up in Millhaven, and the Corwell family, it was beginning to appear, had built something substantial here: a manufacturing company, a real estate holding company, several related subsidiaries, and at some point Diane had been close enough to that operation to understand how it worked from the inside. And then, at some later point, she had stopped being close to it at all. He stayed at a motel near the storage facility. That Saturday night, he sat at the small desk under the window and read through the files he'd brought with him, organized chronologically, his mother's handwriting guiding him through a story she'd never told him out loud. The earliest documents were from 1987, the year Marcus had been born. His mother was 23. She'd been working as a junior bookkeeper for Corwell Industrial, the family company run by her uncle, Raymond Corwell. The documents from this period were ordinary, expense reports, payroll records, standard internal financial statements. His mother's handwriting in the margins was explanatory, the notations of someone learning a job. By 1990, the tone changed. The margin notes became questions, numbers that didn't reconcile, transfers between accounts that had no corresponding invoice or authorization, payments to companies he couldn't find listed anywhere else in the records. His mother had started tracking these discrepancies in a separate ledger, a small bound notebook he'd found in one of the plastic bins. She'd dated each entry, noted the amount, tried to trace where the money had gone. By 1992, she'd stopped working for Corwell Industrial. He knew this because she'd filed a single document in a folder labeled Separation, a formal termination letter from Raymond Corwell, terse and without explanation, dated March 15, 1992. His mother had written one word across the top in red pen. Expected. The following year, she'd married Gordon Teller. By 1994, Marcus was in first grade and asking why they never visited his mother's family. He sat with that for a long time. His mother had known something, had documented it carefully, kept it hidden, paid for storage from a trust account that must have taken planning to set up, and left the key with his father who, in what Marcus was beginning to understand as a characteristically useless gesture, had handed it to a 16-year-old being put out of his own home without once suggesting it might be important. He called Darren that night because Darren was the person he called when he needed to think out loud without being given advice before he was finished. My mother left me something. I don't know what it means yet, but it's bigger than I thought. Define bigger. The kind where you need a lawyer who isn't already involved. Darren was quiet for a moment. You want me to come down? Not yet, but maybe next weekend. He went back to the storage unit on Sunday and spent 6 hours working through the remaining boxes. What he found, piece by piece, was a portrait of a company hiding money. His mother hadn't known everything. The picture she'd assembled was incomplete, the view from one angle, but what she had documented was enough to show the outline of something large and deliberate. Money going in. Less money appearing in the places it should have appeared. The difference accounted for not at all. The steel cabinet against the back wall opened on his third attempt with the combination. His mother had left the numbers on a card tucked into the back of the small notebook, written in the margins of an unrelated grocery list, disguised as a telephone number. He'd almost missed it. Inside the cabinet were 4 things. The first was a bundle of letters, tied with a rubber band that had dried and cracked with age. He handled them carefully, the rubber band disintegrating when he touched it. The letters were addressed to his mother from someone named Charlotte Voss, postmarked from an address in Millhaven between 1992 and 1994. The handwriting was different from his mother's, angular, decisive. The second was a manila envelope containing a set of architectural blueprints. Old ones, hand-drawn rather than printed, the paper yellowed at the edges. They showed a building, a large one, multi-story, the kind of detailed plans that architects drew when they expected the structure to stand for a long time. In the corner, a label, Corwell Building, Harmon Street, Millhaven. Original drawings, 1953. The third was a small leather journal, not his mother's. The initials on the cover were R.C. Raymond Corwell, his mother's uncle. The fourth was a key, modern, flat, the kind used for safe deposit boxes. Attached to it with a thin wire was a tag, and on the tag in his mother's handwriting, First National, Millhaven. Box 887. Charlotte has the authorization letter. Charlotte Voss. He looked at the name again on the envelopes. Whoever Charlotte Voss was, his mother had trusted her enough to make her the gatekeeper for whatever was in that bank box. And Charlotte Voss had been writing letters to his mother from Millhaven 25 years ago. He drove back to the motel and looked up the name. There were several Charlotte Vosses in public records. The one in Millhaven was 81 years old, retired, listed at an address on a street called Meadow Lane. Her name appeared in connection with a retired teachers association and in records that went back further with the Millhaven City Clerk's office, where she had apparently worked for 31 years. He thought about what it would mean to knock on a stranger's door at 81 years old and say, "My mother left me your name. She died 25 years ago, and I'm only now reading her mail." He thought about the key with the safe deposit box number. About 4 boxes of financial records that documented something his mother had considered worth hiding. About 22 years of carrying a storage unit key in a wooden box on his dresser without ever using it. He thought about his mother, who had been sick and tired and 32 years old when she died, and who had still taken the time to organize all of this, to pay for a trust account, to leave him a path. He wrote Charlotte Voss's address in his phone and drove to Meadow Lane. The house was small and well-maintained, a brick ranch with a tended front garden that had gone dormant for winter but showed evidence of real care. A wind chime made from shells hung from the porch roof. A mat at the door read, "Come in," were mostly harmless. He knocked. The woman who answered was small, white-haired, and looked at him with eyes that were immediately sharp in the way that people who've processed a lot of information develop over time. She studied his face for a moment before he'd said anything, and something shifted in her expression, not recognition, exactly, but something close to it. "You look like Diane," she said. "That's my mother. I'm Marcus Teller." Charlotte Voss held the door open wider. "I've been waiting 25 years for someone to come. Come inside. I'll make coffee. You'll want to be sitting down for this." The inside of Charlotte's house was the kind of organized that came from a lifetime of working with records. Books and files and labeled folders occupied 2 walls of what might have been a living room in another household. Photographs covered a third wall, arranged chronologically, the kind of deliberate personal archive that suggested she'd always understood that documentation mattered. She handed him coffee and sat across from him at the kitchen table and looked at him carefully for a moment before she began. "Your mother and I met in 1991. She'd been working at Corwell Industrial for 4 years by then, and she was beginning to understand what she'd walked into. She came to me because I worked at the city clerk's office, and she'd found discrepancies in property records that went through our office. Transfers that shouldn't have happened. Permits issued for buildings that were never inspected. The kind of paper trail that's invisible if you're not looking, but obvious if you are." Marcus wrapped his hands around the mug. "What was the Corwell family doing?" Charlotte's expression was steady. "The full picture took me 30 years to assemble, but the outline your mother brought me was enough to understand the shape of it. Raymond Corwell was laundering money through his construction company and his property holdings. He had been for at least 15 years by the time your mother noticed. And he wasn't doing it alone. He had partners, city officials, a bank officer, a judge who retired conveniently in 1995. The money came from somewhere upstream, something larger that used Corwell Industrial as a cleaning mechanism. How much money are we talking about?" Charlotte went to the filing cabinet in the corner. She retrieved a folder, brought it back to the table, and set it between them. "By the time I finished my own documentation, I estimated the total flow through Corwell and associated entities at somewhere between $200 and $300 million. Over approximately 30 years. Marcus was quiet for long enough that Charlotte looked up from the folder to check his face. "My mother found this when she was 23. She was brilliant," Charlotte said. "And she was honest in the way people are honest when it's a matter of character rather than convenience. She could have said nothing. She could have taken the salary and let it alone. She didn't. She got fired instead." Charlotte nodded. "And warned, though she didn't share the specifics of that with me. She told me once that someone from her uncle's office had come to the house after she was let go. That whatever they said had been enough to make her understand that staying quiet was the condition for staying safe. But she kept the records. She kept copies of everything she'd already documented. She gave me copies to keep separately, and she left the rest for you. She left a key to a safe deposit box. She said you have the authorization." Charlotte went to the same filing cabinet and came back with an envelope. It had Marcus's name on the front, written in his mother's handwriting, with "to be given to Marcus when he comes" below it. It had never been opened. He sat with the envelope in his hands for a moment, feeling its weight, which was substantial. He opened it carefully at the flap. Inside was a folded letter, handwritten, several pages, dated March 1997, 2 years before she died. And beneath the letter, a legal document, the authorization for the safe deposit box, notarized, with his name on it. He read the letter at Charlotte's kitchen table while she sat quietly on the other side and looked at her own coffee. His mother's voice came off the page as clearly as if she'd been in the room. "Marcus," she wrote, "if you're reading this, then you're old enough, and I'm not there, which is the way I was afraid it would go. I want to start by telling you that nothing that happened was your fault, and everything you'll find here was meant for you. I'm going to tell you something I couldn't tell you while you were small, because some knowledge makes you a target, and I didn't want you to carry that. But you're carrying the key now, which means you know enough to find the rest, and I owe you the truth. When I was 23, I discovered that my family was criminals. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that would make a good story if you told it at a party. In the way that some corruption is slow, quiet, systematic, built into the structure of a respectable business over decades so that it looks like normal until you look closely enough. I looked closely enough. That was always my problem. What I found, and what I documented, and what I've arranged for you to access, is evidence of financial crimes that have never been investigated. The people involved have spent 30 years believing they got away with it. Raymond Corwell is still running his business. The people who helped him have retired comfortably. Nobody has ever looked at what I found and done anything about it, because nobody outside of Charlotte and me has ever seen it. I couldn't go to the police. Raymond made very clear what would happen if I did. He didn't threaten me directly. He wasn't the kind of man who made his own threats. Someone else delivered the message, and the message was clear enough. I had a son. I had a life I wanted to continue living. I made the choice to stay quiet. But I couldn't destroy what I'd found. That felt like a different kind of wrong. So I kept it. And I organized it. And I put it somewhere that would outlast me, because I believe that evidence this clear doesn't disappear just because the people it implicates want it to. Truth has a way of surviving things. There is a safe deposit box at First National Bank, Millhaven. Box 887. Charlotte has the authorization document. What's in that box is the most significant part of what I found. I couldn't keep it at home. I couldn't keep it in the storage unit where it might be found by someone going through old things without understanding what they were looking at. The bank was safer. What's in that box is not just documentation of what Raymond Corwell did. It's documentation of where the money came from before it reached him. And that upstream source is the part that matters most. I couldn't finish this, Marcus. I ran out of time. But you have what I assembled, and you have Charlotte, and you have whatever you've become by the time you're reading this. Finish it if you can. If you can't, I understand that too. This is your life, not mine, and I won't reach from wherever I am to make it harder. But if you do decide to look at the Corwell building on Harmon Street. Look at the blueprints. And look underneath. Your great-grandfather built that building in 1953. He built it to last. And he built something into it that Raymond was never supposed to find. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't be there longer. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I knew that from the first day. Mom. Marcus folded the letter along its original creases and held it in both hands for a moment. Then he looked up at Charlotte, who had been giving him the privacy of looking somewhere else. The Corwell building on Harmon Street, he said. Charlotte nodded once, slowly. Is it still there? It is. Raymond sold it in 2004 when the company restructured. It's been through 2 owners since. Currently, it houses a logistics company on the lower floors. Upper floors have been empty for years. What's in the safe deposit box? Charlotte looked at him carefully. I don't know the full contents. Your mother was specific about that she wanted you to see it yourself, without someone else's interpretation in front of it. But I know she described it once as the piece that makes everything else make sense. He called Darren that night. Get down here, he said, and take a few days off. This got complicated. Darren arrived Monday morning in his own truck, having driven through the night. He was a broad-shouldered man with the kind of steady energy that made people trust him in situations that called for practical solutions rather than opinions. He listened to everything Marcus had told him about his mother's files, about Charlotte, about the letter, without interrupting. Then he said, What's the play? First the bank, then the building. What are we looking for? Marcus pulled out the blueprints from the storage unit, his mother's copy, the original documents showing the Corwell building as it had been designed in 1953. He spread them on the motel desk and pointed to a section in the basement level. His mother's handwriting, penciled in at the edge of the blueprint. Not in the plan itself, but in the margin, small and careful. He built something into it. Look underneath. There's a sub-basement, Marcus said. It's not on the original plans that are filed with the city. I checked the public records online last night. The city has blueprints for this building that show 2 basement levels. The blueprints my mother kept show 3. Darren looked at the drawings for a long moment. Your great-grandfather built it in 1953. Raymond inherited the company in the 1970s. Whatever is down there, Raymond either never knew about it, or he knew and couldn't get to it, or he found it and used it and then sealed it back up. His mother's note said Raymond was never supposed to find it, which means it's possible he never did, Marcus said. It's possible it's been sitting there for 70 years. They went to First National Bank on Tuesday morning, Marcus with the authorization document and his identification. The box was in the vault on the lower level, a larger-than-average box that took 2 staff members to carry to the private viewing room. They left Marcus alone with it. The contents were layered, carefully arranged to be read in order. His mother had put a single sheet of paper on top with a numbered list of what was inside and the sequence in which he should look at it. Even here, even in this, she had been organized. She'd been a bookkeeper to the end. He followed her instructions. The first item was a bound report, typewritten on paper that had aged to cream, dated 1991. The cover sheet read, Internal Audit Corwell Industrial Holdings, Preliminary findings prepared by D. Corwell. His mother's maiden name. A report she'd written at 23, in the months before she was fired. The second item was a ledger. Not a copy, the original, bound in green cloth, the handwriting inside it meticulous and dated. Years of entries, beginning in 1974. Raymond Corwell's handwriting, which he recognized from the journal he'd found in the storage unit. This was different from the journal. This was operational, a running record of transactions with codes and abbreviations that would have meant nothing to a casual reader, but which his mother had cross-referenced in her audit report with patient clarity. The third item was a photograph, black and white, showing 4 men at a table. On the back, in handwriting he didn't recognize, Millhaven, 1971. R. Corwell, D. Harmon, P. Vance, K. Rice. Below the names, his mother's annotation. This is where it started. The fourth item was a set of documents that took him 20 minutes to work through. Legal papers, transfer records, correspondence between Corwell Industrial and 3 shell companies whose names meant nothing to him, but whose addresses were all variations of the same post office box in a town 2 hours from Millhaven. And the fifth item, the last one in the sequence his mother had specified, was a single folded page, handwritten in a script that was neither his mother's nor Raymond Corwell's. Older paper, the fold lines soft with age. The writing was precise and economical, the hand of someone accustomed to producing documents that needed to hold up. It was a letter from his great-grandfather, Elliot Corwell. To whoever finds what I've built, it began. I am writing this in 1953, the year the building is being completed, because I am not certain I will be alive when it becomes necessary. I am 67 years old and in good health, but 67 is old enough to know that certainty is not a thing you can purchase. I built this building with money I earned through legitimate means over 40 years of manufacturing work. I also built something into its foundation that has nothing to do with manufacturing. What is stored in the sub-basement of this structure is the result of decisions I made in the 1930s and 1940s that I have spent 30 years trying to correct for. I will not detail here everything that I did. That accounting is kept separately, and the people who need to know it will find it through the proper channels when the time comes. What I will say is this. The assets stored in the vault below were accumulated through methods I am not proud of. I could not in good conscience keep them. I could not in good conscience donate them in a way that would require me to explain their origin. And I did not trust those who would inherit this company to make the right decision if I left them knowledge of what I'd done. So I built the vault and I sealed it. And I'm writing this letter so that someone, someday, will understand why it's there and what it means. The value of what is stored is substantial. As of today, in 1953, I estimated at something near $2 million in gold and certain instruments. By the time this is found, I cannot predict what that will be worth, only that it will be more. I am leaving this letter here because I want the person who finds it to understand. This money does not belong to the Corwell family. It never did. It belongs to the people it was taken from. And since most of those people are dead or dispersed or impossible to locate with precision, it belongs to the public good, to schools, to hospitals, to the kind of work that builds something lasting. I am trusting whoever reads this to do the right thing with it. Not because I am naive enough to believe everyone will, but because I built this letter into a structure designed to survive, and I believe that structures built will tend to end up in the right hands eventually. Elliot Corwell, October 14th. 1953. Marcus sat in the private viewing room of First National Bank in Millhaven for a long time after he finished reading. His great-grandfather had hidden something in the basement of a building that had stood in this city for 70 years. His mother had known about it, or at least known the building held something significant. She had kept the original blueprints, the ones showing 3 basement levels instead of 2. She had left him the path. And Raymond Corwell, who had run the family company for 30 years and laundered hundreds of millions of dollars through it, had apparently never found what his own grandfather had hidden in the building's foundation. Marcus photographed every document in the box before he left. He carried the originals back to the storage unit, which he'd now rented officially, and locked them in the steel cabinet. He drove to Charlotte's house and told her what he'd found. She listened with the stillness of someone who has spent a long time waiting for news and has learned that patience is not the same as peace. Then she said, "You need to go look at the building." He already knew that. But knowing something and doing it were the same distance apart they'd always been, and the step between them required something he was still assembling. He drove to Harmon Street that afternoon. The Corwell building stood at the corner of Harmon and 5th, 6 stories of brick and limestone, built in 1953 with the confidence of someone who expected it to outlast them. The lower floors showed the signage of the logistics company Charlotte had mentioned, though the loading dock on the south side looked underused. The upper floors were dark, windows dusty. He stood on the sidewalk across the street and looked at it for a long time. His mother had stood here. He was certain of it, though he had no proof. She had worked in this building for 4 years, had noticed the numbers didn't add up, had spent a year documenting what she found, and had ended up fired and warned and quietly erased from the family record. She had taken the blueprints and a key and a leather journal and put them somewhere that would survive her. And then she had come home and made dinner and helped him with his homework and read him stories at bedtime and never said a word. He went back to the motel and opened his laptop. He spent the evening cross-referencing what he knew. The shell companies from his mother's files. The names from the back of the photograph. He ran searches on Raymond Corwell, on Corwell Industrial Holdings, on the companies associated with the transactions his mother had documented. Raymond Corwell was alive. 79 years old, retired in 2008, living at an address in a suburb east of Millhaven. His company had been sold to a private equity group in 2004, broken up, the pieces distributed. The building on Harmon Street had gone with the sale. The name Harmon in the photograph D. Harmon was a detail that kept surfacing. He found a Douglas Harmon in the records of the city's planning department, retired, and a Harmon Street named after the same family, which was either coincidence or history making itself obvious. He looked up P. Vance and found a Peter Vance who had been president of First National Bank, the same bank, where his mother had kept the safe deposit box from 1968 to 1991, and K. Rice, a Kenneth Rice who had served as a judge in the county court from 1975 to 1997, for men in a photograph from 1971, a bank president, a judge, a city official, and Raymond Corwell. His mother had written, "This is where it started." He called Ellis Adis's office in the morning. "I need to ask you something about how inheritance law works," he said. "When a property contains assets that have been there for 70 years and the original owner died intestate, and the chain of custody is complicated." Ellis was quiet for a moment. "I think you need to come in, Mr. Teller. And I think you should bring everything you've found." Marcus brought Charlotte. The three of them sat in Ellis's office for 3 hours. Charlotte had her own files, decades of documents she'd assembled from the city clerk's records, cross-referenced with what Diane Teller had given her. Ellis reviewed everything with the focused attention of someone whose professional instincts had been activated by something genuinely unusual. By the end of the afternoon, Ellis had made 4 phone calls and arranged 2 additional appointments. "This is going to require a federal dimension," he said. "The interstate nature of those shell companies, the potential for existing statutes of limitations, the question of who technically owns what is in that sub-basement, none of this can be handled at the county level." He looked at Marcus. "You understand what you're potentially opening." Marcus thought about his mother, 23 years old, finding numbers that didn't add up and deciding that mattered. He thought about Elliot Corwell writing a letter in 1953 and trusting it to whoever found it, whenever that turned out to be. He thought about 22 years of carrying a key in a wooden box without using it. "I understand," he said. Then he said, "What do we do first?" Ellis made a note on his legal pad. "First, we get someone into that building to confirm what's actually down there. If the vault exists and contains what you think it contains, that changes everything. If it doesn't, we're dealing with a different kind of problem. Can we get access?" Ellis tapped his pen against the desk. "I know the current owner's legal representative. The building's been in litigation over a zoning issue for 18 months. Nobody's paying much attention to it right now." He paused. "I can make a call." The access came through 2 days later, framed as a building assessment requested by the current owner's insurer. Marcus and Darren accompanied a structural engineer named Kevin Park, who had been briefed on exactly what they were looking for and had agreed to professional discretion in exchange for a fee that Ellis had characterized as fair. They entered through the loading dock on the south side, early on a Thursday morning before the logistics company's regular staff arrived. The interior smelled like industrial cleaning products and the faint undercurrent of old building materials, concrete and old timber, and something metallic underneath. The basement levels were accessed through a utility stair at the back of the building. The first level held mechanical systems, old boilers, newer HVAC equipment, electrical panels updated across several decades. The second level was storage, half filled with the accumulated detritus of the logistics company's operations. Boxes, equipment, plastic shelving. Marcus had the blueprints. His mother's copies, showing the third level. According to the drawings, the access was behind the east wall of the second basement, behind what appeared on the plans to be a utility chase. Kevin Park ran his hands along the wall, tapped it at intervals. His expression was professionally neutral, but Marcus could see him paying attention in the way that people pay attention when they encounter something that doesn't match their expectations. The wall here is 12 inches thick, Kevin said. The chase on the other side should only require 8. He moved the flashlight along the surface. And the brickwork pattern changes here. See this? He indicated a section where the mortar lines ran at a slightly different angle. Different period. Someone added to this wall, or concealed something behind it, Marcus said. Kevin stepped back. Before I do anything structural, I need to understand my liability here. Elliot had anticipated this. The documentation he'd prepared gave Kevin clear parameters. He had authorization from the building's current owners, mediated through Ellis, for a non-destructive assessment. Anything beyond that would require additional steps. Non-destructive, Marcus repeated. Can you tell what's behind there without taking it apart? Kevin pulled equipment from his bag, a device that looked like a modified stud finder. He ran it methodically across the wall section, watching the readout. He stopped, ran it back, stopped again. There's a significant void, he said. Approximately 15 by 20 feet, based on this. The density signature beyond the void is consistent with stacked metallic material. He looked at Marcus. A lot of it. How much? Kevin shook his head. I can give you volume. I can't give you value. But whatever's in there is heavy enough that the structural load calculations for this floor account for it. Elliot Corwell built this floor to hold weight. He knew it would need to. Marcus looked at the wall. 70 years of brick and mortar and 2 families' worth of secrets. He pulled out his phone and called Elliot. We need to talk about next steps, he said. The vault is real. The drive back to the motel that night was quiet. Darren drove. Marcus watched the city pass outside the window. Millhaven, where his mother had grown up, where she had worked and discovered something too big to handle alone, where she had been warned into silence and spent the rest of her life carrying what she knew. She'd left him a map, not because she thought he could fix it easily or safely or without cost, but because she believed that what was in that building didn't belong to the people who thought they owned it. And because she'd trusted him, sight unseen, across the distance of years she hadn't lived to cross, to make that right. He thought about the $47 in the envelope, the note from his stepmother, his father's handwriting on the tag of the storage key, barely legible, like the man had been ashamed. He thought about 16 years old on a sidewalk in October, putting a rusted key in his pocket and walking away from a life that had stopped having room for him. 22 years. He'd built something from nothing. Twice. First himself, then everything that came after. And now there was a third thing to build, the answer to what his mother had left unfinished, the completion of what Elliot Corwell had put in motion 70 years ago. Some things take the time they take, Marcus thought. That doesn't mean they aren't coming. He put his head back against the seat and closed his eyes and let Darren drive. Tomorrow there would be more calls to make, more people to talk to, more steps in a process that was going to be long and complicated and expensive and possibly dangerous. He'd already understood from Charlotte's expression when he'd told her about the vault that there were people still living who would prefer this stayed buried. Raymond Corwell was 79 and retired, but retirement didn't change what you'd done or what you might do to protect it. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, in the silence of a city he was learning to know, Marcus Teller felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope. Exactly, that word was too light for what it was. Something heavier. The particular weight of a thing that has finally stopped being just potential and started being real. His mother had been right. Truth doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right person to come looking. He slept heavily that night, the first real sleep in 4 days, and woke before the alarm to the particular quiet of a motel room just before dawn, when the highway outside is empty and the building hasn't yet started its morning movement. He lay in the dark and let himself think without organizing it, which was the kind of thinking he did best. His mother had been 23 when she found the ledger discrepancies. She'd spent a year documenting what she saw, building a case no one had asked her to build, out of nothing but the conviction that numbers told the truth if you listened carefully enough. She'd been fired for it, threatened for it, silenced for it. And then she'd done the most quietly remarkable thing he could imagine. She'd packed everything into boxes, arranged for storage, set up a trust account from savings that must have been difficult to accumulate on a single income, and left a map for a child who was still years away from being old enough to read it. She'd done all of this while sick, while raising him alone, while whatever fear Raymond Corwell's messenger had put into her was still fresh enough to matter. He thought about what that kind of resolve required. Not courage in the dramatic sense, the movie version of courage, where you square your jaw and walk into the fire. The other kind. The kind that got up every morning knowing what it knew and kept going anyway. The kind that made grocery lists and helped with homework and read stories at bedtime, while carrying something that most adults would have found too heavy to hold. He hadn't known any of this. He'd been a child, and then a teenager, and then a young man trying to survive his own version of impossible. And his mother had carried hers completely alone because the weight of it was hers to carry, not his. She'd made that choice deliberately, and he understood it now. In the way you understand certain things only after enough time has passed to see the shape of them clearly. He got dressed, made coffee on the small machine by the window, and stood looking out at the parking lot while it brewed. The sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. An early delivery truck moved through the intersection a block away. There was a version of this story where Marcus Teller turned the boxes over to Elliot, let the lawyers handle it, accepted whatever financial outcome emerged from the legal process, and went back to his life at Consolidated Fabrication. Nobody would have blamed him. He'd found what his mother left. He'd reported it to the appropriate parties. His part was done. But there was Raymond Corwell in his retirement house on the east side of town, 79 years old, still alive, who had fired a 23-year-old bookkeeper and sent someone to her door to make sure she understood the consequences of talking, who had built a career and a reputation on money that wasn't his and had never, not once, faced what he'd done. And there was Elliot Corwell's letter, written in 1953, trusting the person who found it to do the right thing. And there was the vault in the basement of a building on Harmon Street, sealed for 70 years, holding something that didn't belong to the people who had owned the building since and never had. Marcus drank his coffee and made a list of what the next steps required. It was a long list. Some of the items on it were procedural conversations with Ellis, coordination with the federal contacts Ellis had mentioned, the question of how the building's current owners would respond to what was under their floor. Some of the items were harder to categorize. How you confronted a 79-year-old man with a lifetime of evidence. How you decided what justice looked like when the people most directly harmed were gone. How you honored a mother who had spent her last years keeping a secret so you wouldn't have to carry it, by carrying it now that she couldn't. He finished the coffee, rinsed the cup, put on his jacket. Outside, the sky had gone from gray to the particular pale blue that belonged to early mornings in cities that hadn't fully woken up yet. Somewhere on Harmon Street, 6 blocks east, a building stood quiet and unremarkable, its lower floors preparing for another day of logistics company operations, its basement holding something that had been waiting longer than Marcus had been alive. He was 38 years old. He had a truck and a toolbox and a machinist's habit of looking at broken things and understanding how they fit together. He had a mother who had trusted him across the distance of 20 years with the most important thing she'd ever found. He was going to finish what she started. He got in the truck and drove toward the building. Ellis had asked for 2 weeks to arrange proper legal access to the Corwell building. What he got instead was 9 days, because the building's current owners, a property management group out of Cincinnati, called Meridian Holdings, were deep enough in the zoning litigation that they were eager for anything that might reframe the asset as worth cooperating over rather than fighting about. Marcus spent those 9 days in Millhaven, working from the motel and making daily trips to the storage unit to continue going through his mother's files. What had initially seemed like 4 boxes of organized financial documentation turned out to be something considerably more layered. His mother had not simply been a bookkeeper who noticed a discrepancy. She had been, in the time between noticing and being fired, conducting what amounted to a private investigation methodically, carefully, with the precision that her training demanded and the thoroughness that her conscience required. The ledger she'd kept in the plastic bin was not a single notebook. It was 7, spanning the period from late 1989 through early 1992. Each entry was dated, sourced, cross-referenced with document numbers that corresponded to the files she'd kept in the archive boxes. She had built the kind of evidentiary record that prosecutors spend years assembling. She had done it alone, in her spare time, while holding a full-time job and caring for a child under 5. Marcus read through all 7 notebooks over the course of 4 days, making his own notes, mapping the network she'd traced. The structure of what Corwell Industrial was doing became clearer the deeper he went. The company was legitimate in its core operations. It manufactured construction components, supplied regional contractors, employed a few hundred people across 2 facilities. But layered over that legitimate business was a second structure, invisible unless you knew how to look. Shell companies received payments from Corwell Industrial described as subcontractor fees. Those payments never corresponded to actual work. The shell companies existed on paper, had addresses that turned out to be mail drops, and passed money through bank accounts that cycled it through 2 or 3 additional layers before it emerged somewhere else, attached to a different name, clean enough to invest in real property. His mother had traced 6 of these shells before she ran out of time. In her final notebook, written in the weeks before her termination letter arrived, she had begun trying to answer a question she'd written across the top of a page in capital letters. Where does it come from? She hadn't finished answering it, but she'd gotten far enough to write 3 names at the bottom of the page, circled and connected with lines like a diagram. The names were not the same as the ones on the photograph from the safe deposit box. These were different, older, less local. One name had a notation beside it, Upstream. Ask Charlotte about V Records. He showed the page to Charlotte on the 6th day. She studied it for a long time, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead in a way that meant she was looking at something she already half knew. V Records, she said. Voight. That was a name that came up in property transfers in the late 1960s. A company called Voight Development that acquired several parcels in Millhaven and the surrounding county. Over about a 4-year period. I always thought the purchases were strange. The prices didn't match the market, and the sellers in several cases were people who'd been cited for zoning violations that then quietly disappeared from the record. She paused. I could never connect Voight to Corwell directly, but the timing aligned. How big was Voight? Charlotte went to her filing cabinet. She had a folder on it, of course. 30 years of patient documentation, cross-referenced and dated. She set it on the table between them. Big enough to matter, she said, and connected to enough people with enough reach that nobody in this city was going to look at it too hard. He spent the 7th day at the county recorder's office pulling everything publicly available on Voight Development. What he found confirmed Charlotte's timeline and added to it. Voight had been incorporated in Delaware in 1963 with registered agents whose names led nowhere useful. It had conducted business in Millhaven and 3 surrounding counties through the late 1960s and into the mid-1970s, at which point it appeared to go dormant. The parcels it had acquired were transferred, across several transactions over several years, to various entities that eventually consolidated under the umbrella of Corwell Industrial Holdings. His mother had been right about the upstream question. Voight hadn't just been connected to Corwell. It had been the predecessor. Raymond Corwell hadn't built the money laundering operation. He'd inherited it, the same way he'd inherited the manufacturing company, from his father, who had built the infrastructure in the 1960s and used Voight as the vehicle. And what was Voight connected to upstream? He didn't know yet, but he was beginning to understand that the vault in the sub-basement of the Corwell building might not just hold 70-year-old assets from Elliot Corwell's guilty conscience. It might hold something more specific than that. Documentation. Proof of where the money had actually originated before it was laundered through 3 generations of a family company. Elliot Corwell's letter had said, the assets stored in the vault below were accumulated through methods I am not proud of. I could not in good conscience keep them. I could not in good conscience donate them. He hadn't said what those methods were. On the 8th night, Marcus called Darren. I need you to understand something before we go into that building tomorrow, he said. Darren waited. What's down there might be more complicated than gold and bearer bonds. My great-grandfather wasn't just feeling guilty about regular business. Whatever he was doing in the 1930s and 1940s, the money he accumulated, he was specific about not being able to explain its origin. He was specific about it belonging to people it had been taken from. Darren was quiet for a moment. You think it's dirty money that goes back further than the laundering? I think the laundering was downstream of something older and worse. And I think whatever documentation he left in that vault explains what it was. Does that change what we're doing tomorrow? Marcus thought about his mother's 7 notebooks, about Charlotte's 30 years of files, about Elliot Corwell's letter, its precise, careful handwriting, the way the old man had written methods I am not proud of and trusted a stranger decades away to understand what that meant. No, he said. It just means we go in knowing the full weight of it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The building on Harmon Street looked different on a Tuesday morning with legal authorization in his pocket. Or maybe it looked exactly the same and Marcus was the one who had changed, who had spent 9 days learning the shape of what was behind those brick walls and could no longer see them as simply a logistics company's unremarkable facility. Ellis met them at the loading dock with a representative from Meridian Holdings, a young man named Davis who wore a visitor's badge and carried a clipboard and looked like someone who had been assigned this particular task because nobody more senior wanted it. 2 workers from a structural contractor Ellis had engaged waited nearby with equipment lighting rigs, a small generator, a core drilling machine that Marcus recognized from construction sites. Kevin Park was there too. He'd driven 3 hours at his own initiative, which Marcus had not expected and had no good way to respond to except to shake his hand. Davis from Meridian Holdings reviewed the authorization paperwork with the careful attention of someone who understood that his company's lawyers had signed something and he needed to make sure everything matched. He signed his own form, handed copies around, and then stepped back with the posture of someone who had fulfilled his obligation and would now observe without participating. The loading dock door rolled up. They went in. The logistics company's regular operation was suspended for the day. Ellis had arranged this as part of the access agreement, compensating them for the lost productivity from the estate's legal fund. The ground floor was quiet, the kind of quiet that large commercial spaces produce when emptied of their usual activity, sounds from outside arriving muffled and distant. The staircase to the basement felt different this time, more deliberate. Marcus went first, the blueprints rolled under his arm, flashlight in his hand despite the lighting rigs the contractor crew was setting up behind him. The second basement, when they reached it, was brighter than before. The contractors had already run lighting down the utility stair on a previous visit to prepare for today. The storage room looked the same. The east wall looked the same. But Kevin Park was already there before them, having come down a separate way, and he was standing in front of the wall section with his scanning equipment and a look on his face that Marcus hadn't seen on him before. Something changed, Marcus said. Kevin looked up. Not changed. I ran the scan again this morning to update my baseline. He gestured at the readout on his equipment. The density signature is consistent with what I measured before, but I ran a wider sweep this time, covering more of the wall. He pointed to a section about 4 feet to the left of where they'd focused before. There's a second void here, smaller, and the structural signature around it suggests it was built at the same time as the main space, same mortar composition, same brick grade. A second chamber, or an antechamber, some kind of access space between this wall and the main vault. He paused. Whoever designed this knew what they were doing. There's a reason it's held for 70 years without anyone noticing. Marcus unrolled the blueprints, held them up in the new lighting. The section Kevin was pointing to corresponded to an area his mother had marked with a small penciled asterisk, no annotation, just the mark. He'd assumed it was incidental, a stray pen movement. He looked at it again. His mother had put that mark there for a reason. She just hadn't had time to write down what the reason was. The contractor crew spent 2 hours carefully removing the brick section. It was designed to come apart, not mortared in the way structural brick was, but set in a clay compound that had hardened with age but yielded to patient work. The men treated each brick as if it might be the one that changed everything, setting them aside in sequence on a plastic sheet so they could be replaced exactly. When the opening was large enough to step through, Marcus went first. The antechamber was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep, the ceiling just high enough to stand in without ducking. The floor was concrete, smooth and dry. The walls were bare brick. At the far end, a steel door, smaller than what Marcus had imagined, about the size of a standard interior door but heavier, its surface a uniform dark gray that had resisted rust better than anything else he'd seen in the building. Beside the door, mounted into the wall at chest height, a combination dial. Brass, original to the installation. The numbers worn smooth from what must have been years of use before the door was sealed for the last time. He looked at the dial for a moment. Then he went back to the blueprints. His mother's penciled asterisk was here, on this section. She'd known about the antechamber. And if she'd known, she'd have left the combination somewhere in what she'd left him. She was too organized not to. He went back through his mental inventory of what he'd found. 7 notebooks. The safe deposit box. The steel cabinet with 4 items. The letters from Charlotte. The letter from Elliot Corwell. The letter from Elliot Corwell. 3 pages of careful handwriting. He'd photographed every page and read it so many times he had most of it memorized. But there had been something at the very end, below the signature, that he'd categorized as a postscript and read quickly in the bank's private viewing room. He pulled up the photograph on his phone. The postscript was 4 lines, written smaller than the rest. He read them again now, slowly. For whoever opens the vault. The dial is set to 3 numbers that correspond to the 3 years in which I made the decisions I most regret. I cannot write them here. They are written in the account book, page 1, under the column heading marked with an asterisk. You will understand when you see it. The account book. Raymond Corwell's operational ledger, the green cloth-bound volume from the safe deposit box. His mother had included it in the sequence she wanted him to read, but he'd focused on the documents around it: the audit report, the photograph, the shell company transfers. He'd looked at the ledger, but not examined it with the attention she'd wanted him to give it. He went back to his truck for the copy he'd made, photographed page by page, printed at the Motel Business Center, organized in a folder. He found page 1. The columns on that page were labeled with standard accounting categories. Assets, liabilities, credits, debits. One column had no label, just an asterisk at the top, exactly as Elliot had described. In the rows below it, a series of 4-digit numbers that didn't follow the pattern of the financial entries around them. He looked at them. Not dollar amounts. Not account numbers. Dates. 4 of them, written as years. 1933, 1941, 1947, 1952. For years, not 3. He went back to the postscript. 3 numbers that correspond to the 3 years in which I made the decisions I most regret. 3 of the 4. And his great-grandfather had said he couldn't write which 3, which meant the 4th was either irrelevant or a wrong combination that would tell him something else was off. He stood in the antechamber looking at the brass dial and thought about a man born in 1886 who had built a building at 67 years old and sealed a vault in its basement and written a letter trusting a stranger not yet born to understand what he meant. Elliot Corwell had said he made the decisions he most regretted in 3 specific years. Which 3 of these 4? 1933 was the Depression. 1941 was the year America entered the war. 1947 was just after it. 1952 was the year before the building went up. The decision in 1952 was building this vault. That was not a regret, that was the correction, which left 1933, 1941, and 1947. Marcus tried the combination. 3 numbers, clockwise then counter, standard mechanical safe protocol. He went slowly, feeling the mechanism. The dial turned. He felt resistance on the 3rd number, and then not a click, exactly, but a settling, the way of precision. Mechanism sounds when everything aligns the way it was built to. He turned the handle. The door swung open. The air that came out was cool and dry, and carried a smell he hadn't expected, not the closed-up mustiness of the antechamber, but something more like the inside of a library. Paper and metal and a faint trace of something mineral. The conditions inside the vault had been controlled somehow. He didn't understand the mechanism until the contractor's lighting rig was brought into the antechamber and extended through the vault door, and he could see the interior clearly for the first time. The vault was exactly the size Kevin's scan had suggested, 15 feet by 20. The ceiling was low, 7 feet at most, and lined with a material he recognized after a moment as vermiculite insulation, the kind used before modern fireproofing materials were available. Someone had understood that the vault needed to be fireproof as well as sealed, and had built accordingly. The walls held shelving, floor to ceiling on 3 sides. Steel shelving, the industrial kind, solid enough to hold significant weight without deflection. On the shelves, stacked with the orderliness of someone who had organized this space with care and time. Wooden crates, each roughly 2 feet by 2 feet, sealed and numbered. He counted them. 47 crates on the shelving, each one labeled in black stencil with a code, 2 letters, and a number. On the fourth wall, no shelving. Instead, a long table, its surface clear except for a single object. A leather portfolio, the kind used for documents, its clasp shut, a small padlock through the clasp. And beside the portfolio, mounted to the wall on a small bracket, a key. He took the key. The padlock opened. Inside the portfolio, 3 things. First, an inventory, typewritten, dated 1953. It listed the contents of each crate by code, with descriptions beside each code. He read the descriptions slowly, his brain assembling what they meant. Gold bullion, refined, stamped. Quantities by crate. Bearer bonds, pre-war, various issuers. Quantities by crate. Coin collections, pre-1933, predominantly gold. Quantities by crate. Jewelry. Watches. Art small format, portable. Quantities by crate. And then, for the last 12 crates, documentary materials. Original instruments. See attached accounting. The second item in the portfolio was the attached accounting. 41 pages, typewritten, organized by year going back to 1929. His great-grandfather's record of where each item in this vault had come from. He read the first page standing in the vault doorway, the contractor's light making sharp shadows across the typescript. What Elliot Corwell had done in the 1930s was not a simple crime. It was, he wrote in the spare language of a man more comfortable with ledgers than confession, a systematic exploitation of people whose desperation made them vulnerable. He had been a moneylender, not the licensed, regulated kind, but the informal kind that operated in communities where banks didn't reach, where people without collateral had no other options. He had charged rates that compounded catastrophically. He had taken property when people couldn't pay, property that had been in families for generations, that held value far exceeding the original loans. He had done this through intermediaries who handled the direct transactions while he remained at a comfortable remove. By 1941, he had accumulated, through these means, assets worth several $1 million by the standards of that era. He was 65 at the time. Respectable. Well-regarded. A successful manufacturer who employed hundreds of people and donated to local institutions and whose name appeared on buildings. He had spent the next 12 years, the record continued, unable to resolve the contradiction between who he had been and who he wanted to be remembered as. Unable to give the money back because the people he'd taken it from were gone, died, dispersed, their families relocated during the war and after, impossible to trace with any confidence. Unable to destroy it because it was too much. Unable to keep it because he knew what it was. So he had built a room. And he had written in the final line of the accounting, in the same precise hand, "I do not ask forgiveness. I ask only that whoever holds this makes it count for something. That is the only repayment possible now." Marcus stood in the door of the vault for a long moment. Darren appeared at his shoulder, having come through the antechamber behind him. He looked at the shelves, at the crates, at the portfolio in Marcus's hands. He didn't say anything for a while, which was why Marcus valued him. Kevin Park appeared next. He looked at the vault with the expression of a professional whose professional frame of reference had just become inadequate. Then he looked at his scanning equipment's readout and said, quietly, "The density figures are consistent with gold at approximately 60% fill. If I'm reading this right, and accounting for current spot prices," he stopped himself. He tried again. "This is north of $250 million. Conservatively." The number landed in the vault's careful air and stayed there. 250 million. Accumulated by a man born in the previous century who had spent 30 years unable to live with what he'd done. Left in a room built to outlast him. Waiting for someone his great-grandson's mother had found a path toward, who had carried a rusted key in a wooden box for 22 years without knowing what it opened. Darren spoke first. "What do you want to do?" Marcus looked at the inventory. At the accounting. At the 47 numbered crates on their steel shelves. At the documentary materials in the last 12 crates, whatever those turned out to be. He thought about what Elliot Corwell had asked for. Not for his name to be cleared or his legacy to be protected. Not for the money to go to his family. He'd asked for it to count for something. He'd asked for the only repayment possible. He thought about his mother, who had worked toward this without ever seeing it, who had spent her career as a bookkeeper out of necessity and her available reserves of courage on something that would outlast her. He thought about Charlotte Voss, 81 years old, with 30 years of files in her living room and a wind chime on her porch, and the patience of someone who had kept faith with a dead woman's request for a very long time. He thought about 16 years old on a sidewalk, carrying a rusted key and a photograph and 2 changes of clothes and no idea at all what he was walking toward. He turned to Ellis Adissa, who had come through the antechamber last, and was now standing very still, his reading glasses around his neck, looking at the vault with an expression that was going to take him a while to fully process. "I want to document everything before anyone touches anything," Marcus said. "I want a full independent appraisal from a firm that has no connection to anyone in this city. I want the documentary materials from the last 12 crates examined by a forensic historian before they leave this room. And I want you to start the process for establishing a proper legal framework for what happens to this." Ellis nodded slowly. "That process is going to take time." "How long?" "Months. Maybe longer. Establishing clear legal title to assets of this nature. Assets with this kind of history." He paused. "There are claims processes. There are federal agencies that will want to be involved. There are questions about what can be traced to specific origin and what can't. What happens to it while that process happens? It stays here, under legal seal. We can arrange for the building to be secured. The crates don't move until the legal framework is in place." Marcus nodded. "Then that's what we do." He looked at the vault one more time. At the shelves built by a man who understood he owed a debt he couldn't repay in the ordinary way. At the careful numbering system, the stenciled codes, the organization of someone who had known this would need to be understood by strangers and had tried to make that as straightforward as possible. He locked the portfolio back in its leather case. He stepped out of the vault. He pulled the steel door closed behind him and heard the mechanism settle back into place. Then he went upstairs to call Charlotte. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did. "We found it," he said. "It's real. It's everything he said it was and more." The sound she made was not quite a word. He waited. Then she said, "Your mother knew. She always believed there was something down there. She left me the map." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "She was so careful about you, Marcus. She stopped. She wanted you to have a life that wasn't built on any of this. A life you'd built yourself. That's why she didn't tell you while she was alive. She wanted you to be established, to be solid, before you had to carry this." He stood at a window on the ground floor of the Corwell building, looking out at Harmon Street, at the ordinary Tuesday morning movement of a city going about its business. Cars. A woman walking a dog. A delivery driver checking a phone. "She got that," he said. "I built the life. It just took 22 years. There was a pause on Charlotte's end, long enough that he thought the call might have dropped. Then her voice came back, slightly different in quality, softer at the edges, like something she'd been holding at arm's length had gotten close enough to touch her. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something your mother asked me to tell you, but only if you made it this far. She didn't want you to know it before, because she thought it would change the way you came at this." He waited. She said, "I have a letter. Not the one in the envelope with the authorization. A different one, written separately, and kept with me directly. She wrote it in 1998, a year before she died. She gave it to me in person, at the coffee shop on 4th Street that's been closed for 15 years now. She said," Charlotte's voice steadied, "she said if you ever came looking, and if you got all the way through, give him this last one. She said you'd have earned it by then. Can I come get it now?" The drive to Meadow Lane took 11 minutes. Charlotte was standing at the door when he pulled up, the envelope already in her hand, small and cream-colored, his name on the front in his mother's handwriting. She handed it to him on the porch without ceremony. "Come in when you're ready," she said. "Or don't. Either way is fine." He sat in his truck on the quiet street and opened it. The letter was short. 1 page. His mother's handwriting. The late version slightly less fluid than the earlier letters. The hand of someone whose body was giving her trouble, but whose mind hadn't softened at all. "Marcus, if Charlotte is giving you this, then you opened the storage unit and the bank box and the vault. You did the whole thing. I'm glad. I always thought you would, but I wasn't certain, and certainty about people you love isn't something you get to keep forever. I want to say something that none of the other letters said, because the other letters were about the work, and this one is just about you. Being your mother was the best thing that happened to me. Not despite everything, not in spite of the situation, not given the circumstances. Just straightforwardly, without qualification, the best thing. You were funny and serious, and you paid attention to things other kids walked past. You used to stop on the way home from school to look at construction sites, just watching the work happening, figuring out how it fit together. I used to hang back and watch you watching. I thought, this kid is going to build something. I didn't know what. I just knew it. You built yourself, Marcus. Out of not much. I know how hard that is, and I want you to know that I saw it, every step of it, from however far away I had to be. The vault and the foundation and whatever you decide to do with all of it, that matters. But it isn't the main thing. The main thing is the person standing in front of whatever door comes next, deciding to go through anyway. That was always you. I love you. I always did. Mommy sat in the truck on Meadow Lane for a long time. The street was quiet. A bird moved through the bare branches of a tree across the road. The wind chime on Charlotte's porch made a soft sound he could just hear through the closed windows. He thought about a boy stopping to watch construction sites on the way home from school, figuring out how things fit together. He didn't remember doing that, but it sounded like something he would have done, and the idea that she'd been there watching, that she'd seen it and carried it, settled into him in a way that nothing else over the preceding 6 weeks had quite managed. He folded the letter, put it in the inner pocket of his jacket, close to his chest. Then he went inside to have coffee with Charlotte and talk about what came next. Charlotte had already set 2 mugs on the table by the time he came through the door. She looked at his face when he came in and asked nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do. She poured. They sat. He told her about the second letter. Not the contents, those belonged to him alone, but the fact of it. That his mother had written one more thing, had kept one more piece back, had trusted Charlotte to hold it until the right moment. Charlotte listened. Then she said, she trusted very few people. She trusted me because she didn't have many options, but she trusted you because she knew you. There's a difference. He thought about that. I'm going to name the foundation for her, he said. I want you on the board, if you're willing. Charlotte wrapped both hands around her mug. 81 years old, she said. I might not be around long enough to be useful. You've been useful for 30 years already. A few more won't hurt. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough to matter. She looked at the photograph wall, at 30 years of documentation organized with the same care his mother had brought to 7 notebooks, and then she looked back at him. All right, she said. I'm in. Outside, Millhaven went about its business, the same city it had always been, slightly changed in ways it didn't know yet. The weeks that followed were not dramatic in the way that moments of discovery sometimes lead people to expect. There was no press conference, no sudden announcement. The work was quiet and procedural and slow, which was frustrating, and also, Marcus came to understand, exactly right. The situation required the kind of care that speed would ruin. He took 2 days between the vault opening and the formal beginning of the legal process to do something that had nothing to do with lawyers or documentation or federal procedures. He drove to the east side of Millhaven to the address he'd found for Raymond Corwell. He didn't go in. He didn't ring the bell. He sat in his truck on the street outside a comfortable brick house with a maintained lawn and a 2-car garage and looked at it for about 15 minutes. Raymond Corwell was 79 years old. He'd run his family company for 30 years, laundered money through it with the confidence of a man who'd inherited the operation from people who'd refined it before him, fired a 23-year-old bookkeeper who got too close to the truth and had been living comfortably ever since. He'd given to local charities. His name was on a scholarship at the county community college. He attended the same Episcopal church he'd attended for 40 years and was known there as a reliable presence who served on the Buildings and Grounds Committee. None of that was who he actually was, but it was who he'd been allowed to be for a very long time, because the person who had known the most about who he actually was had been a young woman with a child and no resources and nowhere to take what she knew. Marcus didn't feel hatred sitting outside that house. He wasn't sure what he felt, exactly something more complicated than hatred, which was simpler than the reality deserved. He felt something closer to the way he felt when he found a component that had been running wrong for years, wearing against its housing in a way that had caused cumulative damage that would eventually become catastrophic. The wrongness had been there the whole time. The fix was straightforward, if overdue. What you felt looking at it wasn't anger, exactly. More like the particular tiredness of understanding that the damage didn't have to have happened, and the particular clarity of knowing what needed to be done now. He drove back to the motel. He called Darren. I looked at his house, he said. And nothing. I just needed to see it. Darren was quiet for a moment. You okay? Marcus thought about it genuinely, which was the only way he knew how to answer the question. Yeah, I think I am. I think I've been okay for a while and just hadn't noticed. You built a decent life, man. Before any of this. I know. Marcus paused. That's the part one keep coming back to. She wanted me to have something I'd made myself before I had to deal with what she made for me. She was right about that. She sounds like she was something, Darren said. She was 23 years old with a baby and a job and a corrupt family, and she still spent a year documenting financial crimes nobody asked her to document. Marcus looked out the motel window at the parking lot, at the familiar view he'd been staring at for 6 weeks. Yeah, she was something. He took one more day before the formal proceedings began, driving out to a stretch of county road he'd found on a map, an area where, according to the property transfer records in Voight Development's history, several families had lost land in the early 1970s. The area was rural, mostly forested now, with a few working farms set back from the road. Nothing to see from a truck window. Just land, the same land it had always been, that had passed through different hands by mechanisms designed to obscure what was actually happening. He thought about Elliot Corwell's accounting, the loan agreements, the property transfer documents. The people who'd signed things they didn't fully understand because they were desperate, because there were no other options, because the system was built in ways that made them vulnerable, and there were always people positioned to exploit that vulnerability. His great-grandfather had been one of those people, had spent 30 years being unable to live with it, had built a room in a basement and left a letter and hoped the math would work out to something better in the hands of whoever came after him. It was an imperfect solution to an unsolvable problem. The specific harm couldn't be fully undone. The people directly affected were gone. The damage rippled forward in ways that couldn't be precisely traced or precisely compensated. What was possible was not justice in the complete sense, but something that moved in the direction of it. Something that acknowledged the harm and put resources toward the communities that had absorbed it across generations. That would have to be enough. It was more than nothing, and nothing had been the status quo for 70 years. The federal engagement came through Ellis's contacts at the Department of Justice, a division that handled financial crimes and asset recovery. The agents who came to Millhaven were thorough and serious and treated Marcus with a respect that he hadn't entirely expected, not as a suspect or a complicating factor, but as someone who had surfaced something significant and was cooperating fully. The documentary materials in the last 12 crates took 3 weeks to examine. A forensic historian named Dr. Amara Osei, brought in from a university in another state, spent those weeks in the vault with the same focused attention Marcus had learned to recognize in people who were good at what they did. She photographed everything. She cataloged it. She prepared a preliminary report that Marcus read in Ellis's office on a Wednesday afternoon in early April. The documentary materials were not simply financial records. They were, as Elliot Corwell had apparently known and been unable to bring himself to describe clearly even in his own accounting, the original instruments, loan agreements, property transfer documents, legal papers through which he had taken what he had taken from the people he had taken it from. 60 years of documentation for transactions conducted between 1929 and 1953 across 3 states, involving hundreds of individuals and families. It was a record of harm in extraordinary detail, which also made it a record of what restitution might look like for those communities and institutions that could be traced forward from the original transactions. Dr. Osei's preliminary estimate of traceable claims families who could be identified through genealogical research, communities whose institutions could be connected to specific transactions, was substantial. Not everyone could be found. Not every dollar could be matched to a specific origin, but enough could be traced to make the exercise meaningful. Marcus read the report twice. Then he asked Ellis to set up a meeting with Dr. Osei and a representative from the DOJ in Charlotte, because Charlotte had 30 years of local property records and was not going to be left out of this. The meeting happened the following week in Ellis's conference room. 5 people around a table: Marcus, Darren, Ellis, Dr. Osei, and an FBI financial crimes agent named Rodriguez who had been assigned to the case and who said very little but listened with the intensity of someone building a complete picture. Charlotte sat at the end of the table with her own files and a cloth bag, 81 years old, and spoke with the authority of someone who had been waiting for this meeting for 30 years. "The parallel investigation," she said, setting her files on the table. "I want to be clear that what's in the vault is not the only thing that matters here. Raymond Corwell built on what his father built, and what his father built on what Elliot built. There are 3 generations of financial crimes here, and the most recent ones are the ones with living victims and living perpetrators." Rodriguez looked up. "Living perpetrators is our jurisdiction." Charlotte pushed a folder across the table toward him. "Then this should interest you." What followed was methodical. The way these things are when the groundwork has been carefully laid over a long time by people who understood that documentation was the only argument that held up. Raymond Corwell was 79 years old. He had not left Millhaven since his retirement. He had not, apparently, imagined that the building he'd sold in 2004 held anything he needed to worry about, or that a bookkeeper he'd fired 30 years ago had left behind anything that could reach him now. He had lived, for 2 decades, in the comfortable certainty of a man who believed he'd gotten away with it so thoroughly that getting away with it had become simply the baseline of his existence. That certainty had a finite number of days remaining. Marcus didn't feel triumphant about that. He felt something harder to name, not satisfaction exactly, not relief, not the clean vindication that stories sometimes promised at moments like this. Something closer to completion. The sense of a process that had been interrupted, long ago, in the offices of a building 6 blocks from where he was sitting, finally moving forward again. He thought about his mother at 23, organizing her notebooks, building her case, waiting to be caught at it. He thought about the termination letter she'd filed under the word expected. She hadn't been surprised. She'd known what was coming and had done it. Anyway, because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing wasn't who she was. He was beginning to understand that it wasn't who he was either. The legal seal on the vault was formally established on a Thursday in late April. The building on Harmon Street was secured. The logistics company relocated temporarily to another facility at Meridian Holdings' expense. The sub-basement access restricted to authorized personnel only. A federal preservation order covered the documentary materials in the 12 crates. An independent appraisal firm from outside the state arrived on Friday to begin the formal valuation process. Marcus watched the appraisers go in, carrying their equipment and their credentials, and thought about Elliot Corwell's letter. The value of what is stored is substantial. By the time this is found, I cannot predict what that will be worth, only that it will be more. He'd been right about that. He'd been right about a lot of things. In the way that people are right when they've spent enough time with their own conscience to understand it clearly, even if understanding it doesn't make any of it better. The preliminary appraisal report came back in 3 weeks. Gold bullion at current spot prices. Bearer bonds, many of which had matured and compounded for decades in instruments that still held legal value. Jewelry and coins assessed by specialized appraisers. Art 4 pieces in the last crate, authenticated by a specialist who flew in from New York and spent 6 hours in the vault looking at them before she would commit to a preliminary opinion. The total preliminary, subject to revision as the process continued, was $287 million. Not 250. 287. Marcus was sitting in Ellis's office when the preliminary figure came through, the same office where he'd sat 6 weeks earlier with 4 boxes of his mother's files and a lawyer who'd told him this would take time. He read the number on the document Ellis set in front of him. Read it again. Looked up. Ellis was watching him with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned, over a long career, to let his clients process things at their own pace. Marcus thought about a 16-year-old with $47. He thought about the wooden box on his dresser where he'd kept the key. He thought about his mother, who had done all of this, organized all of this, trusted all of this forward to someone she loved more than she had ever been able to say to him directly while she was alive. $287 million, he said, mostly to hear how it sounded spoken aloud in a quiet room. And that's before the documentary materials are fully assessed, Ellis said. If the restitution claims generate any additional instruments or settlements, the number changes again. Marcus nodded slowly. Outside Ellis's window, Millhaven moved through an ordinary afternoon. People walking, traffic running its patterns, the logistics of a mid-sized city proceeding without awareness of what had shifted in its basement. He thought about what his great-grandfather had written. I am trusting whoever reads this to do the right thing with it. He thought about what his mother had written. Finish it if you can. He set the appraisal document on the desk. He said, I want to talk about what happens next. Ellis picked up his pen. Marcus began. He'd thought about this more than he'd let himself acknowledge, in the days between opening the vault and receiving the appraisal. He'd thought about it in the motel at night, on the drives between the storage unit and Charlotte's house and the building on Harmon Street. He'd thought about it in the shower and at the gas station and sitting in traffic. What do you do with a thing this size? What does doing the right thing look like when the right thing has a dollar figure that starts with 200 million? The first answer was straightforward, and he'd arrived at it immediately. The money that could be traced back to specific people and families and communities needed to go toward making those communities whole. That was what the documentary materials in the last 12 crates made possible. Dr. Osei's forensic work, combined with genealogical research and whatever the DOJ's investigation could add, would identify where the harm had been done. The money would follow the harm. The second answer was harder. For the portion that couldn't be traced, assets accumulated through intermediaries so distant from the original transactions that the chain was broken beyond recovery, there needed to be something else. Not a personal windfall. Not a quiet settlement. Something that created the kind of lasting good that Elliot Corwell had been unable to articulate in his letter because he was a man of his era, and his era didn't have the language for institutional accountability. He knew what he wanted. He'd been carrying it around in the back of his mind for a week, testing it from different angles, checking whether it held up under pressure the way a well-machined part held up under load. A foundation. One with a specific mandate, not general charitable purposes, but a targeted mission. Support for people navigating the gap that he'd navigated at 16. People who'd been pushed out or aged out or fallen out of the systems that were supposed to catch them, who were trying to build something legitimate from whatever they'd been left with. Vocational training. Legal aid. Housing stability. The exact categories that had made the difference between his trajectory and what it might otherwise have been. He'd been honest enough with himself to acknowledge that this was personal, that he was designing something shaped by his own experience of being 16 with $47. But he didn't think that made it wrong. He thought it made it specific, and specificity was what most foundations lacked. He told Ellis all of this. Ellis listened without interrupting, making notes with the anyway, because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing wasn't who she was. He was beginning to understand that it wasn't who he was either. The legal seal on the vault was formally established on a Thursday in late April. The building on Harmon Street was secured. The logistics company relocated temporarily to another facility at Meridian Holdings' expense. The sub-basement access restricted to authorized personnel only. A federal preservation order covered the documentary materials in the 12 crates. An independent appraisal firm from outside the state arrived on Friday to begin the formal valuation process. Marcus watched the appraisers go in, carrying their equipment and their credentials, and thought about Elliot Corwell's letter. The value of what is stored is substantial. By the time this is found, I cannot predict what that will be worth, only that it will be more. He'd been right about that. He'd been right about a lot of things. In the way that people are right when they've spent enough time with their own conscience to understand it clearly, even if understanding it doesn't make any of it better. The preliminary appraisal report came back in 3 weeks. Gold bullion at current spot prices. Bearer bonds, many of which had matured and compounded for decades in instruments that still held legal value. Jewelry and coins assessed by specialized appraisers. Art 4 pieces in the last crate, authenticated by a specialist who flew in from New York and spent 6 hours in the vault looking at them before she would commit to a preliminary opinion. The total preliminary, subject to revision as the process continued, was $287 million. Not 250. 287. Marcus was sitting in Ellis's office when the preliminary figure came through, the same office where he'd sat 6 weeks earlier with 4 boxes of his mother's files and a lawyer who'd told him this would take time. He read the number on the document Ellis set in front of him. Read it again. Looked up. Ellis was watching him with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned, over a long career, to let his clients process things at their own pace. Marcus thought about a 16-year-old with $47. He thought about the wooden box on his dresser where he'd kept the key. He thought about his mother, who had done all of this, organized all of this, trusted all of this forward to someone she loved more than she had ever been able to say to him directly while she was alive. $287 million, he said, mostly to hear how it sounded spoken aloud in a quiet room. And that's before the documentary materials are fully assessed, Ellis said. If the restitution claims generate any additional instruments or settlements, the number changes again. Marcus nodded slowly. Outside Ellis's window, Millhaven moved through an ordinary afternoon. People walking, traffic running its patterns, the logistics of a mid-sized city proceeding without awareness of what had shifted in its basement. He thought about what his great-grandfather had written. I am trusting whoever reads this to do the right thing with it. He thought about what his mother had written. Finish it if you can. He set the appraisal document on the desk. He said, I want to talk about what happens next. Ellis picked up his pen. Marcus began. He'd thought about this more than he'd let himself acknowledge, in the days between opening the vault and receiving the appraisal. He'd thought about it in the motel at night, on the drives between the storage unit and Charlotte's house and the building on Harmon Street. He'd thought about it in the shower and at the gas station and sitting in traffic. What do you do with a thing this size? What does doing the right thing look like when the right thing has a dollar figure that starts with 200 million? The first answer was straightforward, and he'd arrived at it immediately. The money that could be traced back to specific people and families and communities needed to go toward making those communities whole. That was what the documentary materials in the last 12 crates made possible. Dr. Osei's forensic work, combined with genealogical research and whatever the DOJ's investigation could add, would identify where the harm had been done. The money would follow the harm. The second answer was harder. For the portion that couldn't be traced, assets accumulated through intermediaries so distant from the original transactions that the chain was broken beyond recovery, there needed to be something else. Not a personal windfall. Not a quiet settlement. Something that created the kind of lasting good that Elliot Corwell had been unable to articulate in his letter because he was a man of his era, and his era didn't have the language for institutional accountability. He knew what he wanted. He'd been carrying it around in the back of his mind for a week, testing it from different angles, checking whether it held up under pressure the way a well-machined part held up under load. A foundation. One with a specific mandate, not general charitable purposes, but a targeted mission. Support for people navigating the gap that he'd navigated at 16. People who'd been pushed out or aged out or fallen out of the systems that were supposed to catch them, who were trying to build something legitimate from whatever they'd been left with. Vocational training, legal aid, housing stability, the exact categories that had made the difference between his trajectory and what it might otherwise have been. He'd been honest enough with himself to acknowledge that this was personal, that he was designing something shaped by his own experience of being 16 with $47. But he didn't think that made it wrong. He thought it made it specific, and specificity was what most foundations lacked. He told Ellis all of this. Ellis listened without interrupting, making notes with the good for it. He left an envelope on the counter with more than he owed, and she called after him as he was leaving to tell him that was too much. He told her it really wasn't. He'd done the same with Celia downstairs, a conversation at her door on a Sunday afternoon that was briefer than the one with Yolanda, because Celia communicated in a different register, practical and warm and unburdened by the need to make moments out of things. She'd listened, said she was glad for him, offered him dinner that he accepted, and that was that. The same version of her he'd always known, unaltered by the information, which was exactly the right response. These were his people. Not many, but real. The kind that stuck around not because of what you had, but because of who you were when you had nothing. He was in the break room pouring coffee when his phone lit up with Darren's name. Turn on the news, Darren said. Any news? The break room TV was tuned to a morning program. Marcus found the remote, switched to local news, and stood watching the lower third of the screen, where a name scrolled past that he'd been carrying in the back of his mind for months. Raymond Corwell, 79, Millhaven businessman, taken into federal custody this morning in connection with financial crimes investigations spanning 3 decades. The anchor was reading from a prepared summary. Marcus listened to the shape of it: money laundering, wire fraud, obstruction, and heard his mother's 7 notebooks in every charge. Heard 30 years of Charlotte's files in the language about documentary evidence. Heard Ellis Adissa's careful work in the precision of the legal framework that had made the arrest possible without a single exploitable gap. They got him, Darren said. Yeah. How do you feel? Marcus watched the TV. A photograph of Raymond Corwell filled half the screen, a formal portrait, the kind used at charity galas and business association dinners. A man who looked exactly like someone who served on the Buildings and Grounds Committee of an Episcopal church. A man whose composure had never, until this morning, been required to hold up against something it couldn't manage. Like something that's been running wrong for a long time finally stopped, Marcus said. He finished his coffee. He went back to work. The story grew over the following weeks in the way that stories about institutional corruption grow slowly at first, then faster as journalists traced the connections his mother had partially mapped and Dr. Osei's forensic work had filled in. The names from the photograph in the safe deposit box surfaced in the coverage. Douglas Harmon, who had been planning director when Voight Development was acquiring properties with suspicious efficiency. Peter Vance, the bank president who had facilitated financial structures that shouldn't have passed compliance review. Kenneth Rice, the retired judge whose case dismissal record showed a particular pattern when Corwell-adjacent defendants appeared on his docket. Harmon and Vance were dead. Rice was 84 and, according to his family's statement through an attorney, in declining health. Raymond Corwell was the only one left standing in any condition to face what they'd all built together. Marcus followed the coverage from a distance, the way you follow news about a place you've left but haven't entirely stopped thinking about. He gave one statement to the DOJ at Rodriguez's request, a factual account of how he'd found the storage unit and what it had contained, with no editorial commentary on what he thought should happen to Raymond Corwell. That wasn't his role. His role had been to find the evidence and make sure it reached the right hands. He'd done that. What he spent most of his energy on during those weeks was the foundation. The Diane Corwell Teller Foundation was incorporated in late April, the paperwork processed with the efficiency that Ellis Adissa brought to everything he handled. Charlotte was on the founding board, as agreed. Darren was on it too, because Marcus trusted his judgment and because Darren had driven through the night to be there when it mattered, and that was the kind of thing you acknowledged in concrete terms when you could. Dr. Osei agreed to serve in an advisory capacity on the restitution process, which would be the Foundation's first major project and its most complex. Ellis had walked Marcus through what the restitution framework looked like in practice. The 12 crates of documentary materials gave them the ability to identify, with varying degrees of precision, communities and institutions that could be connected to specific transactions in Elliot Corwell's accounting. Some of those connections were clear enough to support direct compensation. Others were diffuse enough that the appropriate response was investment in the communities themselves: schools, health clinics, vocational programs, the kind of infrastructure that had been underfunded for generations and whose underfunding had at least partial roots in the extraction that had taken place. It was not a clean process. It was not the kind of justice that arrived fully formed with clear recipients and obvious amounts. It was the kind that required patience and specificity and willingness to keep working when the work was hard and the outcomes were uncertain, which was, Marcus had come to understand, the only kind that actually existed. He called Charlotte twice a week. She had opinions about everything, which turned out to be exactly what a founding board needed: someone who had been paying attention long enough to know where the easy answers were wrong and the hard ones were necessary. "How are you doing?" he asked her on a Wednesday evening in early June. "I'm 81 years old," she said, which was not quite an answer. "I know, but how are you doing?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'm doing something I've wanted to do for 30 years. So I'm doing well. I'm tired, but well." He told her about the preliminary conversations he'd had with a vocational education organization in the Region 1 that worked specifically with people who'd aged out of the foster system, who found themselves at 18 with no support network and no particular reason to believe that anyone had thought carefully about their future. The organization was underfunded and effective and had been looking for a serious long-term partner for years. It was the most direct line he could draw from his own experience to someone else's. He'd had Mr. Adeola noticing him when he was exhausted. He'd had a vocational grant that someone had set up for exactly the kind of person he was. He'd had Darren, who hired him and then treated him like someone worth developing. The chain of small interventions that had made the difference between his life and some other life wasn't glamorous or dramatic. It was just people showing up in specific ways at specific moments. The foundation was going to be that, at scale. Not charity in the abstract, support in the concrete, targeted, durable kind. Charlotte listened to the description of the vocational organization and then said, "Your mother would like this." The practicality of it. I know. She was not a person who responded well to grand gestures. Your mother. She always wanted to know what it actually did. I got that from her, apparently. You got a lot from her, Charlotte said. More than you know, probably. The appraisal finalized in June. The number moved slightly from the preliminary figure. As final appraisals due, some items came in higher than the initial estimates, particularly 2 of the 4 authenticated artworks and a set of pre-1933 gold coins that turned out to be rarer than the initial appraiser had assessed. The bearer bonds required additional legal work to establish their current redeemable value, some of which was straightforward and some of which involved instruments that had changed hands through bankruptcy proceedings in ways that required untangling. The final figure, certified by the independent appraisal firm and reviewed by Ellis and the DOJ and filed in the legal proceedings establishing the foundation's asset base, was $291 million. The number was reported in the coverage of Raymond Corwell's case, which was where most people encountered it. By then, the story had moved from local Millhaven news to regional and then national attention, carried partly by the corruption angle and partly by the human element. The woman who had spent the last years of her life organizing evidence nobody asked for, and the son who had carried a key in a wooden box for 22 years before opening the door it belonged to. Marcus gave 2 interviews. Both were print, both to journalists who came recommended by people he trusted, both conducted with the explicit understanding that the focus was on the foundation and the restitution process and not on him personally. He was uncomfortable with the attention in the way that people are uncomfortable with it when they were raised to understand that the work was the point and the recognition was incidental. The first interviewer asked him what it felt like to find out his mother had been doing this while he was a child. He thought about the question for long enough that the journalist noted it in the piece. The pause, the consideration, the sense of someone trying to answer with precision rather than with the expected emotional shorthand. It felt like meeting her again, he finally said. A version of her I didn't know existed. And then realizing that version was there the whole time. The second interviewer asked what he wanted people to take from the story. He said, that your mother might be doing something important that you don't know about. That the people who love you might be working on things they can't tell you yet. That patience and documentation and refusing to destroy what you found, those things outlast almost everything else. He went back to Millhaven in July for the first foundation board meeting, held in a conference room at Ellis's office that was just barely large enough for everyone. Charlotte sat at one end of the table in a blazer she'd clearly bought specifically for the occasion, which Marcus found quietly moving. Darren sat across from her, sleeves rolled up, notepad out. Dr. Osei joined by video from her university office. 2 additional board members, a community development specialist and a forensic accountant who Ellis had recruited, completed the group. They worked through the agenda for 4 hours. The restitution framework, the vocational education partnership, the legal process timeline for the vault assets, the question of how the foundation would be governed and who would have authority over what decisions. At the end of the meeting, Charlotte proposed that the foundation establish an annual lecture in Millhaven on the subject of financial documentation and civic accountability, named for Diane Corwell Teller. Open to the public. Free. The motion passed unanimously. Walking out of the building afterward, Marcus stopped on the sidewalk at the corner of Harmon and 5th and looked down the block at the Corwell building. It was in the process of being transferred to a historic preservation trust, part of the legal settlement, part of the agreement Marcus had negotiated with Meridian Holdings in exchange for cooperating fully with the building's accessibility during the investigation. The vault would eventually be open to the public, documented and interpreted by Dr. Osei's team, a physical record of what had been hidden there and why and who had finally come looking. Darren stopped beside him. You're thinking about it, Darren said. The day we went in. I'm thinking about what she must have felt standing outside this building every morning, Marcus said, knowing what was inside it. Going in anyway. Recording everything. Darren looked at the building for a moment. She was something. She was 23 with a kid and a corrupt family, and she still spent a year building a case nobody asked for. He paused. I want to be that kind of person. Man, Darren said. You already are. They went to dinner after, the 2 of them in Charlotte, at a restaurant on 4th Street that Charlotte had been going to for 40 years, and that still made the same lemon chicken it had made when she started coming. They talked about things that had nothing to do with vaults or foundations or federal investigations. Charlotte told a story about a city council meeting in 1989 that had apparently descended into genuine chaos over a zoning variance for a used car lot. Darren told the story of the first car he'd ever worked on as a teenager, a 1974 Buick that had left him stranded 3 times before he finally understood what was wrong with it. Marcus sat between them and felt the particular quality of evenings where the people around you have earned their place at the table and everyone at it knows it. He thought about all the evenings like this he hadn't had. The years of motel rooms and solo meals and conversations conducted primarily with himself. The particular loneliness of building a life when you're doing it without a net, without family, without anyone who knew you before you knew yourself. He didn't regret any of it. You couldn't regret the thing that made you capable of being where you were now. But he was glad it was changing. The Raymond Corwell trial began in September. Marcus didn't attend. He followed it through Ellis's updates and the news coverage, which was extensive and which he read in the mornings before work with the focused attention of someone completing a task rather than satisfying curiosity. The evidence presented was largely his mother's. Not attributed to her publicly, in most of the coverage the legal language was about documentary evidence and financial records and forensic accounting, but Marcus knew the shape of what had built the prosecution's case. He'd held every notebook. He knew which entries had become which charges. What the coverage couldn't convey, and what only Marcus fully understood, was the cumulative labor behind each numbered exhibit. His mother sitting at a kitchen table, probably after he was in bed, cross-referencing payment records against shell company registrations. His mother on her lunch break, photographing internal documents before filing them back in the correct order so no one would notice. His mother writing numbers into a spiral-bound notebook with the patient deliberateness of someone who understood that a single transcription error could undermine the entire structure. She'd been doing this while working full-time, while raising a child alone, while already knowing that the discovery was inevitable and that the discovery would cost her the job, and possibly more than the job. He thought about that every time he read a new article about the trial. The coverage spoke about financial crimes in the abstract institutional language that reporting on corruption required, and he read between every line for the specific human labor that had made the prosecution possible. The labor of a 23-year-old bookkeeper who had decided that the truth was worth the cost, even though the cost was hers alone to pay. Raymond Corwell's defense was what defenses in cases like this always were. The records were incomplete, the interpretation was selective, the transactions had legitimate explanations that the prosecution had deliberately ignored. His attorneys were expensive and competent and mounted the kind of defense that would have been effective against a less complete record. But his mother had been thorough. 7 notebooks spanning 3 years. Cross-referenced against original documents she'd kept copies of, against public filings she'd tracked through the county recorder's office, against the internal ledger she'd taken the professional risk of photographing before she was fired. The prosecution's forensic accountants had spent 4 months with her materials before trial and described them, in Ellis's paraphrase, as the most organized private documentation of financial crime they'd ever encountered. Someone had asked, in a deposition Marcus wasn't present for, who had compiled the original records. The answer, entered into the official transcript, was Diane Corwell Teller, deceased, former employee of Corwell Industrial Holdings. She'd been in a courtroom 30 years after she'd built the case. In the form of the case itself, the trial lasted 11 weeks. The verdict came on a Tuesday in November, the kind of cold, clear day that Millhaven got in the transition between autumn and winter, when the sky was the particular blue that looked painted rather than natural. Guilty on 14 of 17 counts. Ellis called within 20 minutes of the verdict. He delivered the information in the neutral professional tone he used for significant news, which Marcus had learned to read as genuine satisfaction expressed in the only register the man allowed himself. Sentencing is in February, Ellis said. Given his age and health, the court will consider mitigating factors. But he is convicted, Marcus. That's done. Marcus was at his kitchen table when the call came. The same table where he'd first read the letter from Ellis's firm 8 months ago, still in his work clothes, still in the apartment he'd lived in for 4 years. The wooden box was still on his dresser. Empty now, and he'd thought several times about whether to get rid of it and had kept deciding to keep it, because some objects earned the right to stay by what they'd held. Thank you, he said to Ellis. For everything. You did the work, Ellis said. I just handled the paperwork. That's not nothing. No, Ellis. Agreed. It really isn't. He stayed on the line for another few minutes after the practical items were concluded, which was unusual for Ellis, who was efficient with his time to a degree Marcus had come to respect. "There's one more thing," Ellis said. "You should know this even though it doesn't change anything procedurally. During the trial, Raymond Corwell's attorneys filed a motion to have your mother's documentation excluded on the grounds that it was improperly obtained. The argument was that she had taken materials from company property without authorization when she was terminated." Marcus was very still. "The motion was denied," Ellis continued. "The judge ruled that the documentation was created by Diane Teller in the course of her legitimate employment and that there was no evidence it had been obtained through unlawful means." But there was a moment in that hearing he paused. Corwell's lead attorney, in arguing the motion, referred to your mother as a disgruntled employee acting from personal grievance. The particular quality of anger that moved through Marcus in that moment was not loud. It was the kind that settled into the bones and stayed there. A man who had stolen and laundered and threatened and fired a 23-year-old woman to protect what he'd built, that man's attorney, in a last-ditch attempt to suppress the evidence that would convict him, had described her as acting from personal grievance. "She was acting from integrity," Marcus said. "I know," Ellis said. The judge agreed. "That's why the motion was denied." The call ended. Marcus sat at the table in the silence of his apartment and let the anger settle into something he could carry rather than something that carried him. It took a while, but it settled. His mother had known, when she was building that case, that this was how she would be described if anyone ever looked closely enough to need to discredit her. Disgruntled, motivated by grievance. A woman who couldn't accept her own termination. She had built the case anyway. She had documented everything anyway. She had trusted that the work itself would be the answer to whatever anyone said about why she'd done it. And it had been. 14 of 17 counts. That was the answer. He sat at the table for a while after the call ended. The apartment was quiet in the way that apartments are quiet when you've lived alone long enough to stop noticing it, and then all at once notice it again. He thought about his mother at 32, sitting somewhere in whatever apartment she'd been living in by then, sick and tired and keeping her notebooks in order, knowing that what she'd documented probably wouldn't go anywhere in her lifetime, deciding to preserve it anyway because the alternative, destroying it, letting it dissolve into irrelevance, wasn't something she was capable of. He thought about Elliot Corwell at 67, building a room in a basement and writing a letter to someone he'd never meet, trusting that the right person would eventually show up. He thought about Charlotte Voss filing property records for 30 years, keeping copies of the ones that didn't make sense, maintaining the archive with the faith of someone who believed that documentation mattered even when it seemed to be going nowhere. He thought about Mr. Adeola noticing a kid who was brilliant when he wasn't exhausted, and finding ways to make sure that kid had somewhere warm to do his homework. He thought about the $47 and the rusted key and the sidewalk in October, and the choice, which hadn't felt like a choice at the time, just the only available direction to keep moving. All of it had been necessary. All of it had been part of the shape of what had led to this table, this evening, this particular Tuesday in November. He called Charlotte. "You heard," she said. "He was convicted." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "Your mother deserved to hear that." "Yeah, but she knew it was coming," Charlotte said. 30 years ago she knew it was coming. She just didn't know when. Marcus looked out his kitchen window at the parking lot below, at the same view he'd looked at 8 months ago when he read the letter from Ellis's firm, and felt something adjacent to curiosity stir in a place that had been mostly numb. "She gave me enough time to be ready for it," he said. That's exactly what she did. He drove to Millhaven one more time before the year ended. On a gray December morning, when the city looked the way winter cities look, when they've accepted that it's going to be cold for a while and have settled into it without complaint. He went to the Corwell building first. The logistics company had vacated completely by then, the building in the hands of the Preservation Trust, the work of documenting and interpreting the vault's contents underway. Dr. Osei's team had set up a temporary workspace on the second floor, surrounded by archival materials and reference texts, and the particular organized chaos of serious scholarship. She greeted him warmly, showed him the preliminary exhibition design that was being developed for the vault's eventual public opening. The 47 crates were still in place, carefully numbered and inventoried, each one a chapter in an accounting that would take years to fully interpret. He stood in the vault for a few minutes. The steel door, which no longer needed to be kept closed, was propped open with a doorstop someone had found somewhere. The shelves were still in place, the crates still in their positions. The table was clear of the portfolio now, which was in climate-controlled archival storage. The combination dial on the antechamber door had been documented and photographed, and would eventually be interpreted for the public as part of the exhibition. He looked at the shelves and thought about Elliot Corwell organizing this space in 1953. The old man would have been alone down here, or nearly perhaps with a trusted foreman or two, people whose discretion he could rely on. He would have placed the crates in sequence, working methodically the way people work when they're doing something they've thought about for a long time and finally committed to. He would have written the inventory in his careful hand. He would have written the letter and placed it in the portfolio and locked the clasp and hung the key on its bracket. And then he would have walked out of the vault, through the antechamber, back into the second basement with its ordinary mechanical systems and its ordinary storage, and he would have sealed the wall behind him. And he would have gone upstairs and out into the street and lived the remaining years of his life carrying the knowledge of what was down there, what it meant, and what he was trusting time to eventually produce. That must have been a particular kind of weight. Not the crushing kind Elliot had made his peace with what he was doing, or made as much peace as was available, but the ongoing kind, the kind that didn't get lighter, that you just got stronger enough to carry. The knowledge that the thing you owed existed, that you'd done what you could toward it, and that the rest depended on someone you'd never meet making a choice you couldn't influence. He had made that choice. He had come. He had opened everything that needed opening. It held, Marcus thought again, standing in the vault where it had always held. 70 years. It held. He drove from the building to Garfield Street, to the storage unit that he was still officially renting on a month-to-month basis. He unlocked it, pulled up the door, stood in the familiar smell of dry paper and old fabric softener. The boxes were mostly empty now. The notebooks had gone to the DOJ and then into evidence and would eventually, when the legal proceedings concluded, be transferred to the Foundation's archive. The blueprints were with Dr. Osei's team. The steel cabinet held a few things that hadn't yet found their permanent home, a folder of documents Ellis had copies of, a small box of items that had been in with the original files and weren't strictly evidentiary, but weren't nothing either. He went through the small box. A photograph he hadn't seen before, printed on the matte paper that was standard in the early 1990s, showing a young woman at a desk with papers spread in front of her, not looking at the camera. She was holding a pen and looking at something off to the left. Her hair was dark, shoulder length, and she had the expression of someone working on something that required full attention and wasn't yet done. He was looking at his mother at 20-something, at work. He turned the photograph over. In her handwriting, in pencil, barely visible, Corwell Industrial, 1990. M. Deserves better than this world. Going to make sure. He stood in the storage unit for a long time, holding the photograph. M. Deserves better than this world. Going to make sure. She had written that when he was 3 years old. When she was 26 and working at her uncle's company and noticing, for the first time or maybe the 100th time, that the numbers didn't add up. She had looked at a world that was already showing her what it was capable of and had decided that her child deserved better than it, and had started figuring out how to make that true. She had kept working on it for the rest of her life. In the notebooks, in the storage unit, in the trust account, in the letter she left with Charlotte for when he got all the way through. He tried to remember himself at 3 years old and couldn't produce anything specific, just the texture of that period, the smell of the apartment they'd been in then, the particular quality of his mother's attention when she was reading to him before bed. He didn't remember her being distracted or preoccupied. He remembered her being present, fully there. Whatever she was carrying in the days at her desk at Corwell Industrial, she had not brought it home in a way that he had felt as a child. She had kept it separate. She had protected that boundary with the same care she brought to everything else, so that her son could have a childhood that was just a childhood, uncomplicated by knowledge he wasn't ready for. He put the photograph carefully in his inner jacket pocket, beside the final letter. Then he pulled down the storage unit door, locked it, and stood for a moment on the Garfield Street sidewalk. The December air was cold and clear, the kind that made everything look slightly more defined than usual, edges sharper, colors more present. He thought about everything his mother had done from this city that she'd never been able to leave publicly, from the life she'd built in the margins of something much larger and more dangerous that she'd chosen to engage with anyway. He thought about what it meant to work towards something you might not live to see completed, to trust forward, across time, to a person who didn't know yet what they were going to be asked to do. He'd been that person. He still was, in some ways. The foundation was barely started. The restitution process would take years. The building on Harmon Street would be a long project. There was more work ahead than behind. But standing on a sidewalk in Millhaven in December, the city quiet around him, the cold making his breath visible, Marcus Teller felt something he recognized now as the particular kind of peace that came not from having arrived somewhere, but from understanding clearly where you were going and why. He'd been disowned at 16 with $47 and a rusted key and a photograph of a woman who was already gone. He'd built a life from the things he could find and the skills he could develop and the people who showed up at the right moments. He'd kept the key in a wooden box on his dresser for 22 years, not knowing what it meant, not ready yet for what it opened. And then he'd been ready. He drove back through Millhaven one more time before leaving the city, past the building on Harmon Street, past Charlotte's house on Meadow Lane, past the church where Raymond Corwell had sat on the Buildings and Grounds Committee for 40 years, past the county recorder's office where Charlotte had spent her career and where the property records told the story of what had happened if you knew how to read them. He drove through the city his mother had grown up in, the city she'd never fully left even when she lived somewhere else, the city that had held everything she'd spent her life building and protecting. He drove past it without stopping, heading toward the highway, toward home. The wooden box was still on his dresser when he got back. He'd kept the key in it for 22 years. Now the key was gone and the photograph was in his jacket pocket and the final letter was in a frame on the wall beside his bed, where he'd put it the day he came home from Millhaven the first time. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the framed letter. His mother's handwriting, the 1998 version, slightly less fluid than the earlier letters, but no less precise. You already are who you are. This is just the finish line of something I started, and I'm glad it gets to be you crossing it. He thought about what it meant to cross a finish line that someone else had run most of the race toward. What you owed the people who'd done the earlier miles. Whether anything you built afterward was sufficient acknowledgement of what they'd carried. He didn't have a clean answer to that. He suspected he wasn't going to get one. Some things didn't resolve into clarity. They just settled into something you could carry. Something that had weight but didn't crush you. Something that reminded you of what mattered every time you felt it. He reached over to his nightstand and picked up his phone. He called Darren. "I'm home," he said. "Good," Darren said. "You doing okay?" Marcus looked at the framed letter on the wall, at the wooden box on the dresser, at the apartment that was his, built from nothing, piece by piece, over years. "Yeah," he said. "I think I really am." The Diane Corwell Teller Foundation opened its first grant cycle in March of the following year, dispersing initial funding to 11 organizations across 3 states, including the vocational education program Marcus had identified early on, a legal aid organization that served people navigating tenant rights disputes, and a housing stability fund that provided bridge support to people who were 60 to 90 days from eviction and needed something specific to prevent a cascade they couldn't stop alone. The sentencing had happened in February, as Ellis had indicated it would. Raymond Corwell received 6 years, with the mitigation his attorneys had argued on grounds of age and health. Marcus had read the sentencing coverage on his phone during a lunch break at work, in the same break room where he'd watched the arrest news 8 months earlier. He'd read it twice, put his phone back in his pocket, and finished his coffee. 6 years. The sentence wasn't the point. The conviction was the point. The 14 counts were the point. The specific legal acknowledgement, on the record, that what Raymond Corwell had done was what his mother had documented it, as being that was the point. 3 generations of corruption had been named in the same trial. Not all of them prosecutable. The statute of limitations protected the dead, but named. In the record, in the county courthouse archive, and in the federal court system, and in every news story ever written about the case. Permanent. Unretractable. The truth on the record, exactly the way his mother had understood it needed to be. Her name was in some of those stories. Not prominently, she was referenced as the original documenter of the financial irregularities, one detail in a longer account. But she was there. Diane Corwell Teller. In the record that the record keepers had tried to prevent from existing for 30 years. She was there. The first cohort of Diane Corwell Teller scholars, 12 people between the ages of 18 and 24 who had aged out of foster care and were pursuing vocational certifications, began their programs in September. Marcus attended the orientation. He didn't give a speech. He sat in the back of the room and watched 12 people who were learning that someone had decided they were worth investing in. Learning it in the particular way that you learn something like that when you haven't expected it, with a guardedness that was protective and a tentative opening underneath that guardedness that was something else. Hope with defenses still up. The kind that took time to become the kind that didn't need defending anymore. He knew that feeling precisely. He'd carried it himself for years. After the orientation, he stayed to talk to a few of the scholars. Not in the formal way, not as a representative of the foundation, just standing in the hallway while people got coffee and waited for the next part of the program. A young man named Jerome was pursuing a certification in HVAC systems. He asked Marcus how the scholarship selection process worked, whether the foundation had a preference for certain fields, whether there was a way to apply for a second year of support if the first certification led to a more advanced program. Marcus answered every question directly. He didn't tell Jerome about the vault or the key or any of it. That wasn't what Jerome needed. Jerome needed clear information about what he could count on. Marcus gave it to him. When Jerome walked back into the orientation room, Marcus stood in the hallway for a moment and thought about being 23 years old with $47 and a vocational grant application that Mr. Adeola had found for him. He thought about the particular quality of being told that someone had created something specifically because they understood your situation, that the gap you were standing in had been noticed by someone who had decided to do something about it. That was what Jerome had just been told. That was what 12 people in a room were figuring out how to believe. He could not have built this without his mother's work. He could not have built it without Elliot Corwell's vault, without Charlotte's 30 years of documentation, without Ellis's legal architecture, without the DOJ's investigation, without the $291 million that had sat sealed in a basement for 70 years waiting for someone to put it to use. But he also could not have built it without Mr. Adeola noticing a kid who was exhausted, without Darren hiring a machinist who didn't have much on his resume except ability and reliability, without Yolanda extending credit to someone going through a difficult stretch, without Celia leaving food by a door and never making it a thing. The small interventions and the enormous ones were the same kind of thing. They were people deciding that someone they could affect deserved better than the situation they were in, and doing something about it with whatever they had available. His mother had had access to financial records and 23-year-old fury at injustice, and the organizational discipline of a born bookkeeper. Elliot Corwell had had guilt and time and the specific skills of a builder. Charlotte had had a job in the city clerk's office and 30 years and the patient faith that documentation outlasted almost everything. What Marcus had was the inheritance of all of them, and his own version of the same conviction. And 12 people in a room learning that someone had decided they were worth the investment. That was enough to be going on with. Charlotte called him that evening, as he was driving home from the orientation. "How was it?" she asked. He thought about how to answer that. About 12 people in a room discovering that there were resources arranged in their favor. About Jerome asking practical questions in the tone of someone carefully recalibrating his expectations upward. About the very specific kind of hope that produced, which was nothing like optimism. It was harder than optimism, more durable, built on something concrete rather than on the general expectation that things might work out. He thought about sitting outside that motel window in Millhaven in February, in the middle of what had felt like an ordinary errand to settle a dead father's estate, with no idea what was about to open. "Good," he said. "It was really good. Your mother would have liked today," Charlotte said. "I know. She would have been in the back of the room taking notes," Charlotte said, with the particular warmth of someone describing something they can see clearly. Making sure everything was documented. Making sure nothing important got missed. Marcus smiled. "Yeah," he said. "That sounds right." He was quiet for a moment, watching the road. Then he said, "Charlotte, I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "The annual lecture. The one you proposed at the board meeting. For the first one, I want you to give it. Not a keynote. Not something formal. Just the story. What you did for 30 years. What my mother brought you in 1991. How you kept the files. Why you kept the files. The actual human account of what it looks like to document something you believe in when nobody's asking you to and nobody's watching." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment. I'm 81, she finally said. I know. But the people who need to hear it most are the ones who are 23 and just starting to notice that something doesn't add up. They need to know that what they do with that noticing matters, even if they never see the outcome of it. That it matters for someone they haven't met yet, in a year they can't predict. You're going to make me cry in my own house, Charlotte said. You cry if you need to. Then say yes. She said yes. He drove home through a city that was going about its ordinary business, the way cities do, carrying in their streets and buildings and institutions the accumulated weight of all the decisions ever made in them, good and terrible and everything between, most of it invisible to the people passing through every day. The kind of weight that was only visible if you knew how to look for it, or if someone who did know had spent 30 years keeping files and waiting for the right moment to hand them over. He parked outside his building and sat in the truck for a moment before going in. The night was cold and clear, winter air that made everything slightly more defined than usual. He thought about the photograph in his jacket pocket. His mother at 20-something, at her desk, not looking at the camera, fully absorbed in the work. The note on the back, M. deserves better than this world. Going to make sure. She had made sure. The vault had been opened. The notebooks were in evidence. The conviction was on the record. The foundation was running. 12 people were in a program that hadn't existed a year ago. He went upstairs. He made dinner. He sat at his kitchen table and looked at the framed letter on the bedroom wall, the 1998 letter, the one Charlotte had held for him visible through the open doorway. You already are who you are. This is just the finish line of something I started, and I'm glad it gets to be you crossing it. He had crossed it, and now he was past it, in whatever territory came after finish lines, which was just more ground to cover in whatever direction mattered most. He was 38 years old. He had a truck and a toolbox and a machinist's habit of looking at broken things and understanding how they fit together. He had a foundation named for his mother and a board of people he trusted and 12 scholars and programs they needed. He had Charlotte's yes and Darren's steady presence, and the photograph of his mother at 20-something that he would have framed before the week was out, and hung beside the letter. He had been disowned at 16 with $47 and a key he didn't use for 22 years. He had built something from nothing. More than once. He was still building. That was who he was. His mother had known it before he did, and had spent her whole life making sure there would be something here when he arrived at it. The wooden box was on his dresser, empty. The key was gone, and what it had opened was real and growing. The record was in the courthouse, and the vault was in the preservation trust, and the notebooks were in evidence, and 12 people were in programs that hadn't existed before his mother's work made them possible. Some things take the time they take. Some doors don't open until the person standing in front of them is ready for what's on the other side. He had been ready. He was still ready. He would keep being ready, because that was the only way to honor the people who had built this far and trusted him with the rest. One evening in late October, almost a year to the day after he'd first read the letter from Ellis's firm, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with the newspaper open to an inside-page article about the Foundation's first grant cycle results. Not front-page news. The kind of coverage that community journalism produced, specific, local, practical, more interested in outcomes than in the larger story that had made those outcomes possible. The article named 2 of the organizations that had received funding and described what they'd done with it. 34 people placed in stable housing through the Housing Stability Fund. 19 people who had completed vocational certifications with scholarship support, 16 of whom were now employed in their certified fields. 34 people who hadn't been evicted. 16 people with careers they were 3 months into. That was real. That was the vault. That was 7 notebooks. That was a rusted key in a wooden box for 22 years. He folded the paper, set it on the table, and looked at it for a moment. Then he got up to make dinner, because there was still food to make and work to do tomorrow, and a year of the Foundation's operation behind him and years of it ahead. And the most important thing about any kind of work was that you kept showing up for it. He kept showing up. That was who Diane Corwell Teller had raised, and that was who he had become, and that was what the key had opened in the end. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.